Hello and welcome to day two of Foreign Policy's inaugural virtual climate summit. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of FP, and it's my pleasure to kick things off again today. I'm still blown away by the terrific discussions we witnessed yesterday. US Presidential Special Envoy for Climate Change, John Kerry, laid out how to partition climate as an issue from other arenas of competition with China. We also had top-level government representatives from Japan, Bangladesh, Denmark, as well as the Prince of Wales, each laying out their country's goals for 2021 and the path ahead to Glasgow. We also had several important voices from civil society and the private sector, all explaining what they plan to do to mitigate climate change. We're going to try and make today just as relevant, if not more. We'll hear from the President of Colombia and the Prime Minister of Iceland. There will be a session devoted to Europe, as well as ones with the view from Capitol Hill, and a session with mayors from Bogota, Buenos Aires, and Milan. Foreign Policy has you covered with all the angles today. Now, of course, we can't do this without you, our audience. If you're logged in at our event page on foreignpolicy.com/events, please remember to submit your questions via the question box below the video player on your screen. We'll try to include as many of your questions as possible during these live sessions. If you're joining us on social media, hashtag FP Climate Summit. Let's make sure this conversation is heard far and wide. And finally, this summit was made possible by our sponsors, which include the Embassy of Japan, the EU, the Nuclear Energy Institute, Chevron, RBC Capital Markets, TechMet, and BHP. Now, let's get started. To kick things off, I want to bring in a journalist with tremendous experience covering world affairs. You've seen her on your TVs, most recently on CBS. Here's Rina Nainen. Rina's going to hone in on a country that last year agreed to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 51% by 2030. The question is, how? Rina, take it away. Rina, I think you're on mute, so I'm going to ask you, this is a classic 2020, 2021 problem. Take it away this time.
Thank you so much, Ravi. I appreciate it. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'd like to bring it right towards the president of Colombia, Iván Duque Marquez. And as you mentioned, Ravi, an incredibly ambitious agenda of cutting greenhouse emissions by 51% by 2030. Mr. President, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rina. It's a great honor for me to be here in this panel. Also, my gratitude to Ravi. And it's always interesting and motivates me a lot to talk about the goals that we have set for Colombia and looking towards Glasgow. As we have said last week in the summit that was called by President Biden, we made very clear that Colombia not only wants to cut by 51% our CO2 emissions by 2030, but we also made the commitment that we want to be carbon neutral by 2050. So we're working along those lines. There are many things that have been achieved, but obviously we also want to set all the policies so that this can be the sustainability decade for our country.
And you've set some incredibly ambitious goals. I want to get to that White House summit in a moment. But first, I want to ask you about climate czar John Kerry, who recently called Colombia a leader in climate change. Why do you think he said that? And is John Kerry right?
Well, let me begin, Rina, by saying that we had a great conversation with Secretary Kerry. We spoke about what Colombia wants to achieve. And let me begin by saying this. Colombia only represents 0.6% of all the greenhouse emissions around the world. And we are one of the most vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. We might be in the top 20. So we made a decision. Even though that we are only 0.6% of all the CO2 emissions globally, we want to act as if we were the number one emitter. And that means that we want to get to 2030 with a reduction of 51% of those emissions. And how do we achieve that? And that's very important because it's not just setting the goal, but making it happen. When I took office in 2018, our energy matrix had on non-conventional renewables only 0.2%. As of today, we're going to get close to 10% by the end of this year, and we want to be close to 14% by the end of my term in August next year. That's the fastest energy transition that you have ever seen in Latin America. But also we're working on clean transportation. We have now, just with the incentives that we established by law, that we have today the biggest private sector electrical fleet in terms of cargo. And the same thing when we look at public transportation, we have now the biggest electrical vehicle fleet for public transportation in Latin America and the Caribbean. We also joined the 1 trillion trees initiative from the World Economic Forum, and we want to plant 180 million trees for next year. But at the same time, we want to reduce in a very significant way deforestation in our country, and we have set the goal to be zero deforestation by 2030. That means that every year we have to work with the mayors, the governors to achieve that. And something that I also want to highlight, we created the policy of the circular economy in our country, where most of the industrial sectors have the mantra of producing, conserving, and conserving, producing. And we also want to establish an ethics for the 21st century in the education system so that we can all be acknowledgeable how we can reduce our individual carbon footprint. So Colombia is working in this effort. But something that I should also highlight is that we have been a leader calling other countries for the Leticia Pact and the protection of the Amazon. Colombia has 6% of the Amazon basin, and that 6% represents 35% of our soil. So protecting the Amazon and protecting the high altitude ecosystems, where we have 52% of those ecosystems from the whole world, means that Colombia will be a leader in this effort. And we definitely want to make the fight against climate change and creating a culture where we can all contribute the most important conviction for the next decade.
Mr. President, we've only got a few minutes left. I do want to ask you about President Biden's climate change summit. What did you hear from that summit that stood out to you?
I think, first of all, I feel very happy to see that the United States has come back to the Climate Change Convention. I think that's it's a great message. And I also believe that there were three things that were said that are going to be decisive. One, it's funding for all this energy transition and the fight against climate change. I think that was a very strong message. And I believe that, for example, having capital increases in the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and in other financial institutions is very important to finance this transition and this effort. And something that I also want to highlight that was very important is energy transition and energy storage. Those were things that were said, and actually Colombia right now has the first bid for energy storage in Latin America. If we move with a more sustainable energy matrix, if we diversify the energy matrix, if we make the transition, and we also have massive storage, just with that particular intervention in that sector, we're going to have very impressive results. So I was very happy to hear that. And I was also very happy to hear Secretary Kerry and Secretary Blinken saying that this is a major commitment. And as we have said, what we want is to work with the United States in the hemisphere so that we both can be leaders in this energy transition and also in protecting our communities from the effects of climate change.
I know you're personally very passionate about leading the charge on climate change, but when you look at polling in Colombia, you mentioned the importance of working with mayors. Climate change isn't really a top issue for the people of Colombia when they're polled. How do you push forward this agenda, especially with an election coming next year?
I think that maybe sometimes the polls reflect the immediate sensibility of the population, and that happens everywhere. But I think Colombia is a country with a high consciousness from the citizens about the importance of protecting our nature, biodiversity. And I see now a big commitment from mayors, governors, and even citizens about achieving the goal of 180 million trees to be planted and fighting deforestation. But also something that I want to highlight is how people have embraced the Clean Mobility or the Clean Transportation Act. And if I may say this, Rina, even in the year 2020, that was the year of the highest impact of the pandemic for the world economy, we had the sales of electric vehicles spiked by 70%. And when we look at the first trimester of this year, it has grown more than 150%. So that means people are getting it in a sense that they all know that they can contribute to reduce their own individual carbon footprint. And that is going to be helpful. And I should say also this, the connection between the citizens and the protection of ecosystems is very important. Colombia is the country with the second biggest biodiversity per square kilometer in the world. We have 52% of all the high altitude ecosystems. And we are very rich in the sense that having 35% of our territory in the Amazon means that we all have to be pretty much aware that every decision we make has an impact. And I think the conscience that we have collectively right now is going to be the most important engine to achieve the goal of reducing by 51% our CO2 emissions in 2030 and being Colombia the first Latin American country to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050.
Mr. President, before you go, I know you're also dealing with the post-COVID recovery efforts. Your country was hit very hard. You're passionate about pushing for climate change. How concerned are you right now about the potential of maybe a leftist candidate winning or rising in 2022 for elections next year, especially as you see these very younger progressive voters?
I think that the world sometimes has the debate between right and left. And I think the most important debate today is not between right and left, but between the demagogues and the pedagogues. The demagogues are those who always say that they are going to have a hot bread for today, but they are incubating hunger for the future. The pedagogues are the ones who tell the people all the efforts that have to be made in order to achieve what we have to achieve as a society. And I think the Colombian people have seen the tragedy in Venezuela, have seen the tragedy in other countries where populism and popularity, just by saying what people want to listen and not what people want to know about how to achieve the big transformation, is what matters today. So I am pretty much positive that and optimistic that the Colombian people will make the right decision and will say no to the demagogues and will say yes to the pedagogues. And I am listening to great proposals from different parties. And I think we're going to have a very important political debate in 2022. We have seen candidates that have been mayors, that have been governors, that have made important transformation in their cities. And I think they're going to be putting the debate, not just about discourse or speeches, but they're going to put the debate on how do we really have to make the recovery. Post-COVID is going to take time. This is not going to be a short-term effort. And we all need to adapt our fiscal policy, our social policy, our foreign policy, our environmental policy to this circumstance with the idea to build back better. So I think that's going to be the main driver of the debate next year. And again, I hope and I am optimistic that the Colombian people will say no to the demagogues and will definitely elect a pedagogue.
President Iván Duque Marquez, the President of Colombia, I want to thank you very much, Mr. President, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rina. It has been a great pleasure. And thank you, Ravi. And I look forward to see you in person in my next visit to DC.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you so much.
All the best.
I want to turn it now to Amy McKinnon, who's an award-winning national security and intelligence reporter right here at Foreign Policy. Amy's reported across Eastern Europe, Moscow, Tbilisi, Georgia, and she's going to be moderating this next panel on a larger climate discussion looking at the circular economy. Hey, Amy, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. What a fascinating conversation. I think no to the demagogues, yes to the pedagogues. What a catchphrase for our era. So for continuing our global conversation today, for our next discussion, we are going to go several thousand miles to the east, back to my home continent of Europe, where I'm really looking forward to having a conversation about Europe's Circular Economy Action Plan. And I would like to welcome to our virtual stage the Director General for the Environment Department at the European Commission, Florica Fink-Hoyer. In her current role, the director is responsible for implementing the European Green Deal objectives, and in particular, the areas of the circular economy, biodiversity, and zero pollution. The European Green Deal is a set of policy initiatives by the European Commission, which seek to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. This action plan includes initiatives along the entire life cycle of products, which aims to create more sustainable value chains across all sectors of the economy. So to learn more about the EU's vision and plans, I'm pleased to welcome Director General Farika Fink-Hoyer.
Welcome.
Thank you for joining us today. And just before we get started, I want to remind our audience that you can submit your questions for the Director General. For all of those who are logged into our event platform at foreignpolicy.com/events, you can submit your questions there in the box below the video player. You can also chime in on social media using our hashtag #FPClimateSummit. Okay, and so without further ado, let's dive into the conversation. So Director General, just given that we have such an international audience today, and I want to make sure that we are all starting on the same page. So could you give me your elevator pitch, your kind of capsule explanation of what a circular economy is?
Well, it can be said in a very simple term. Basically, it is an economy that is regenerative and that gives back more, or at least doesn't take more from the planet that it needs. I mean, it's basically one that minimizes the impact on biodiversity as well, or reduces climate change emissions.
And so I understand that a key part of this is deconstructing that relationship between economic activity and the reliance on the consumption of finite resources. In other words, decoupling. How do you approach that, and how do you go about decoupling economic growth and resource use?
We just heard in the previous session that I heard the word catchphrase, build back better. But what I would say, we want to build back not only better, but also greener. And circular economy, if you want, is a tool in that in that context, because this is a climate summit, right? And we are not only looking at climate change, because for us, it's all interlinked also with biodiversity loss, with pollution. And if you then want to change the way you consume, but also you produce, you have to start somewhere. And that is where circular economy comes in. And it really tries to look at especially those industries that are very energy intensive, but have therefore also a big potential for circularity, because we could lower the impact by addressing circularity in these sectors. And that could be steel, that could be building, could be textile, could be electronics, different sectors. And the very idea is that we start to have an economy where we start by looking at the entire production and value chain. And then, of course, you can couple it with fiscal incentives and with tax incentives. But it's also a very new approach, how you want to produce and consume. That's really the heart of it, if you want.
And what needs to be done to support that transition to a circular economy model in the European Union? And what advice do you have for other countries and regions who would be looking to learn from Europe's experience in this?
Well, we are starting ourselves, right? I mean, we try and want to be a bit of the front runner, but it is a very long haul exercise. What we have done now is we have what we call the European Green Deal, which is our political framework. But then we come with legislation that gives a regulatory framework, which allows for industry who really have to go into really massive transformation and changes and investment to give that necessary predictability in order to go into that and that path. So you need regulatory clarity. You also need to explain to consumers what is in for them. I think also from an environmental point of view, obviously there is a logic, but you also have to demonstrate the different interrelationships. Because, as I said, you have climate change. Climate change you cannot address if you do not address biodiversity loss. Because we all know we had just last week, we had the climate law politically adopted. If we want to come to climate neutrality in 2050, We need also healthy oceans, healthy land, healthy peatlands, wetlands, but also healthy production chains, and also forest. Now, you would say, what has that to do with circularity? Actually, quite a lot, because if the idea behind circularity is I have a different way how I use natural resources, and I factor that in, it's basically your natural capital, into my production process, and I go for sustainable production, then I also lower emissions and halt biodiversity loss, regulate or reduce pollution, and so on and so on. So again, it all is going linked together. Let me perhaps allow you to give a concrete example, because I think it's always very, very abstract. Take waste. Waste is always seen as, what do we do with it? Actually, in Europe, what we are wanting to regulate is that we will prohibit probably the shipment of waste outside Europe. Now, from an ethical point of view, I would say that's the right thing to do, because nobody wants to see, very toxic or bad waste ending up in a third country on a landfill or in incineration. So that's clear from an ethical point of view. But when you look at it from a business point of view, you would also see that waste is a commodity, a very precious commodity. And then therefore you have to start looking at, if you want to have waste and turn it afterwards into what we would call a secondary high quality raw material, you need to know what is in a product. So you start by the design of the product, you look at it, what we will want to do with a electronic passport, so that you know and you can follow a product and you say, okay, this is from the design, this is how I can split it up later. Can I reuse it? Can I recycle it? Can I repair it? All these type of steps. So the whole value chain, and that starts in the production chain. But to be quite honest, if you look at this waste, it also means a lot of raw materials that are very precious for us now, in also from the point of view of strategic autonomy. I mean, you're a security expert, so clearly that has also a value. So circular economy probably ticks a lot of boxes.
That's fascinating. So right from the creation of the product right through to its afterlife in the waste pile. I'm curious, how does the transition to a circular economy affect job creation, and how will it affect the types of jobs that people have in the future?
Let me make it a little bit the business case, because a lot of people think there's no business case to make, and they think only about recycling and often on low-skilled jobs. Well, we come out of a crisis, whenever we come out of the crisis of the pandemic, honestly, we will need all types of jobs. We will need low-skilled jobs, high-skilled jobs. We will need to invest in artificial intelligence and all of this. When we stay on this idea of recycling and waste, all these type of jobs you will find in a circular business model, because what we now have is actually a linear economy. And in a linear economy, you have an increasing demand for probably scarce resources. Take even water, which we take for granted, but water becomes, actually even security terms, a very, very scarce resource. So if you know that in a circular economy, you would reuse water and so on, you also respond to a business need. Coca-Cola, Danone, they all reuse their water now because they factored them in their production chain. But it gives you also price stability, because you know how you can plan for the use of your natural resource. It secures you more, let's say, raw materials in a way, and you can make savings. And now probably you can also attract much more investment into your business if you have a circular economy business. I mean, we have now the green bonds. We are quite proud of it. And we can see, when you look at the private sector, a lot of business want to go, or finance sector, they all want to invest more into circular economy, sustainable production chains. Why? Because they have a security of a long-term yield, instead of investing in, for instance, fossil fuels. So the business case is not to be underestimated, and that generates jobs. And that's what we need now in the green recovery.
Absolutely. I mean, you briefly there touched upon the the topic that none of us can escape these days, the pandemic. Could you go into a little bit more detail about how that's expected to affect this transition to the circular economy?
Now, first of all, I mean, the pandemic is #1 priority for everybody around the globe. And let's also say it, there is a human tragedy which we are not even starting to oversee and will stay with us for almost a generation. And it's quite heartbreaking and it's real. But if we also look at it from an environmental point of view, it was a wake-up call from nature and clearly confirming that we want to go not build back better, but build back greener, right? So we found it as hard as it is, ultimately it is a confirmation that we have to change track and go into circularity and a different way of production consumption. So you could also say, oh, the lockdown measures, the lockdown that we have seen in many parts of the world has reduced all of this pollution, but it's not what we want. It's not that we say, oh, therefore we just stop, growth and everything. Actually, the circular economy is a way to continue on growth, but in a responsible manner. When we had the EDG, or when we had our circular economy action plan, it was already coming out before the crisis or the pandemic hit us. So we are not now wavering course. On the contrary, as I said, we feel confirmed that we have to have even more a green recovery, even more a green transition. But let's also say it is a very long-term whole. It's not something which comes immediate. We now direct a lot of investment into that, also in our recovery plans, which linked to the COVID crisis. So the big money that is coming for recovery after COVID has, at least to a certain percentage, go into green and green transition. So there you have the link. So yeah, there are lots of links, but we have to build on it as in a positive way. Let's say it like this.
I'm curious, how does the circular economy affect the European Union's trade with the international world? I mean, how is this going to affect the relationship with the United States, but of course other allies and partners around the world?
Well, actually, we see a shift where, especially now take the US, we were thrilled to see that now, especially Envoy Kerry had the meeting with his Chinese counterpart, and a lot of the narrative that we were trying to put forward, we found back also in the same statement. And I must say, also, when we now look at the two big summits that are coming, the one on climate change, but also one on biodiversity, we see, hopefully, perhaps I'm not over optimistic, but we see that there is awakening by those who were sort of more observers that we have to pull forces together. Actually, we had a leaders pledge last year in the UN, which we generated, but we also had a lot of global alliances now. There was one on circular economy, for instance, now in February, March, launched at the Environmental Assembly, UN Assembly, together with UN, and lots of countries are now joining because, as I said, it's a combination of people realizing there's an ethical, a scientific reason that we have to stop, we have to change, but there's also an economic reason. And I mean, it is not to their detriment, but it still needs a lot of explanation. But we are quite actually pleased to see that in the G7, in the G20, in the summits, there's a whole discussion around how we have to rally together around, be it climate change or biodiversity loss halting or circularity. It's all in a way intertwined and interlinked, and we see more and more commitments coming, and that is actually what we really need, a global change, a global commitment, and also some monitoring, I have to admit, because otherwise, I mean, people can pledge, but then there's no change, and it doesn't help if in Europe we will say, oh, we will become the green continent, and if around us the world is burning, it doesn't help. We want everybody to profit from the same, and we have to work together here. And we see the US as a very big ally in that context, very big one. So lots of hopes on that.
You sound optimistic, which is always refreshing to hear. What were your takeaways from the climate summit last week that President Biden hosted?
Actually, encouragement, encouragement also for us, also for the bilateral relationship, absolutely. But not only that, as I just said, of sort of hope also where we will go to the COP26 and COP15, because as I said, both go together. It is not possible just to speak about only climate change as reducing the industrial emissions. I think it becomes absolutely clear whoever wants to reach climate neutrality have to factor in the natural carbon sinks. And if you destroy the natural carbon sinks, like the forest and so on, you can't achieve this. So we saw a lot of commonalities, a lot of work ahead, I have to say that. It's not a given, but encouragement, I would really use that word.
Mm-hmm. We have one audience question has come in from Sarah Gingrella, who is in France, who works with an organization called Trivlav Circle. And the question is growth really necessary? What about Tim Jackson's concept of prosperity without growth?
Mm-hmm. There are different views, and I don't want to talk here about an ideological view. I fully understand the question. But I'm also a realist. I mean, you said, yes, you sound very optimist, but I think we need to also get everybody on board. What we want to have, as I said, is a regenerative economy, because at least we do not want to do more harm than we have done so far to nature, to our planet. Now, it's like with flying. I don't think that people will stop flying, even though now in the lockdown we have seen nature resplendent, came back because we stopped flying. They won't. But it will be important to go on in which type of aviation do we want to go. Also there, you can go to different use of energy, different types of flying. Let's face it, there will be a cost on the consumer as well. I think, but then again, it's if you now start investing in what we would call a regenerative economy, and one which also allows then that the pricing has to not end up on the most vulnerable or on the most deprived. Because when we talk about a regenerative economy, also we want to have social fairness. That I think is a word so far I have not used, but it's very, very clearly on our mind as well. Whether you achieve that only by saying, I don't have any growth anymore, I don't believe this is the way out, because we need jobs and everything, but it has to be a different type of growth. And partly this will be very different. And I'm very hopeful also on new generations who probably have been marked now by this unfortunate COVID crisis, that they will hopefully not go back in, I have to consume and without taking into account the impact it has on natural resources. Because there is an end. They are not infinitive. So we have to rethink about it. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Director General, for this fascinating discussion. We could keep you all day, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to let you go and pass the baton on to our next session. Thank you so much for joining us. So now,
thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I would like to pass the baton to our next session moderator. Halima Croft is the Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy, Global Research at RBC Capital Markets. She is also a regular contributor to CNBC. Halima specializes in geopolitics and energy, leading a team of commodity strategists that cover metals and cross-commodity investor activity. Halima has received many industry accolades throughout her career, including Breaking Energy's Top 10 New York Women in Energy. We're delighted to have her host the next segment. Halima, welcome to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Amy. Now on to a domestic policy perspective. I would like to welcome Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Murphy is a leading advocate of a progressive foreign policy approach that calls for strong American leadership on human rights, good governance, and the fight against climate change. A prolific writer, I am sure Senator Chris Murphy is well known to all the readers of Foreign Policy magazine. Now that I've dispensed with my way too abbreviated introduction, I'd like to get right into the questions. If you have a question for Senator Murphy, please make sure to send it to us in the Zoom chat. Welcome to Senator Murphy. The big question we have for you to start off is, How is climate change a national security threat?
Halima, I think Senator Murphy is not quite here yet. He's running a touch behind schedule. So you're stuck with me for a little bit longer.
Okay, well, why don't we have a chat then?
I'm interested by your first question, though. Climate change is a national security threat. That was one of my big takeaways last week from the climate summit, was of course the speech from the head of US intelligence, Avril Haines, where she described climate change as an intelligence threat, as the biggest national security threat for the country. And I'm looking forward to hearing Senator Murphy talk about that when he gets here, because I thought that was an interesting and refreshing shift to hear from the head of the country's intelligence agencies. What were your big takeaways from the climate summit?
Well, I think that's such a unique perspective, because I started my career actually in the intelligence services after graduate school. And I actually was, part of a group looking at sort of global energy security issues. And it was right after 9/11. And we were very much focused on the idea of, American energy security through security of supply, and essentially safeguarding all the supplies of oil globally. And I think it's really interesting to look at now how the fight against climate change has become such a national security priority, and whole questions about, what happens and what are the risks of inaction in terms of heightened global conflict.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's something that I've heard from other folks who've worked in intelligence agencies, and they have looked at these issues since, for decades, going back to the 90s. But I mean, what do you make of the fact that that the head of intelligence was at the climate summit, and B, the fact that she spotlit it in such a way? I mean, what message does that send?
I mean, I think it sends a message that it's really infusing all aspects of US foreign policy. It's not a side issue. It's, a central focus of this administration. And it's going to be something, again, that sort of animates all of our bilateral relations with governments. It's going to be something that, if you are working in the intelligence community, it's a first order priority. And I do think that really is a sea change, because yes, there have been analysts for years looking at issues about sort of water wars, scarcity of resources, but to have it a front and center issue, I think that is really a profound change in terms of US foreign policy and national security policy.
And it's not just the US, actually. Over the weekend, the British Sunday Times had an interview with the new head of MI6, or C, as he's sometimes better known. And I was interested that he also echoed Avril Haines' comments and said that climate change was going to be, I mean, he spotlit some of the more traditional threats of great power competition, but that going forward, the kinds of things that our children and our grandchildren will be focusing on, he said that very much climate change was the thing to be looking at. So not just the United States, certainly.
I think one of the really interesting issues that I would love to dive into more with Senator Murphy, and it came up in the discussion yesterday with John Kerry, is what does this mean in terms of our relations with some of our key countries like China? I mean, how do you sort of manage the idea of competition and cooperation? And do you potentially get linkages in terms of needing cooperation on climate change? What does that mean for how you pursue, discussions with the Chinese on issues like Hong Kong, Taiwan, treatment of the Uyghurs? So I think all of this is going to be very, very interesting. And I think Senator Murphy is now here, so we can begin this conversation.
Hello, sorry I'm running a little late, but glad to be with you guys.
Welcome, Senator Murphy. So the first question that we have for you, we've already done your introduction. So the first question we really have for you is, why is climate change a national security threat?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it is clearly a national security threat to the United States. First of all, our primary duty is protect our democracy, and we saw how fragile it was just this January as thousands of people stormed the Capitol. Climate change robs people of the ability to be economically secure and successful, as we have to devote more and more money to adaptation in the United States as storms ravage the country, as our ability to produce goods shifts from certain parts of the United States to others. This is an economic security issue to the United States. It is, of course, a global security issue as well. And we have dozens of very discrete examples of how more extreme weather leads to greater political instability. Syria is the example that is most often cited, in which What happened to lead to the fall of the Assad regime was the massive movement of people from the countryside, from farming communities, into crowded cities. Government was unable to provide resources with that number of people coming to the cities in such short amount of time. Ultimately, it led to political instability. But the reason why people were fleeing the countryside and moving into the cities was because of a series of epic droughts in Syria that are no doubt connected to the changing climate. And we can tell that same story in Mali and parts of Africa. So we see instability as a consequence of climate change. It's not a coincidence that today we have more internally displaced people, more people living in refugee camps than at any time in our lifetime. And the planet is warming at a cataclysmic rate.
Senator Murphy, you've insisted in a number of the publications that you've written for that the U.S. must reclaim the leadership in the fight against climate change. What would you give the Biden administration? How would you grade them so far on that effort?
Well, and listen, they have put climate front and center. They have telegraphed in a clear way to the world that if you want to be in business with the United States, if you want to be a friend and an ally, then you have to be meeting your climate goals. Now, we have to be able to not lead just with words, but with actions. And so the President's American Jobs Plan, which is a climate plan, is a big part of our ability to deliver on the promises we made at Paris, but also to be able to, effectively push other countries to the table. So we've got to do our part in Congress. It's so important that we pass the jobs plan, which includes, for instance, a massive expansion of electric vehicle usage in the United States in order to be able to lead internationally. And then we've got to do our best to try to make this bipartisan. I will tell you, this is the most encouraging development in the United States over the last year, is the increasing tendency for climate to be approached on a bipartisan basis. Last year, we passed a landmark new regulatory regime on HFCs. 5 years ago, inconceivable we could have done that with Republicans. Did it with major Republican support last year. Every week I have a new conversation with a Republican senator who I didn't think I could partner with on climate, who now wants to come to the table. That kind of bipartisan consensus allows us to have more consistency in our policy, which allows countries to be more willing to do business with us on the issues connected to climate.
Senator Murphy, can we delve a little deeper into the sort of prospects for the $2 trillion infrastructure bill and all the really important green initiatives that are in that bill? I mean, how do you see it progressing through Congress? I mean, what are the prospects that it's going to be passed? What's the process for getting this passed? And where do you see the greatest bipartisan consensus in terms of efforts to tackle climate change? And where do we still see the greatest divergence between Republicans and Democrats on this issue?
Well, there's clearly, more consensus on non-CO2 sources of emissions, right? So when you're talking about methane or HFCs, when you're working internationally in sort of, soot reduction, we have a better opportunity to get bipartisan cooperation. But as I said, I think the ground is shifting very quickly here. And I do think that the lens through which we view this is increasingly competition with countries like China. There's going to be a country in the world that's going to dominate the future advanced battery market. Why shouldn't it be the United States? Why should we continue to see leadership on the production of photovoltaics and wind turbines? And so I do think Republicans are coming to the table in part because they just see the tremendous lost opportunity when it comes to job impact in the United States. The bill itself, I think, has good prospects for passage. I don't know whether we'll get Republicans to support it in the end. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm contradicting myself on the guess that Republicans are more willing to work with us on climate. I just think, when it comes to these big legislative packages proposed by Democratic presidents, Republicans' instinct is to generally sit on the outside rather than be on the inside.
I think a lot of us are watching sort of Senator Joe Manchin and where he's going to sort of come down on this issue. So do you think that the Democrats will remain sort of united on this issue and you can get this through?
Well, listen, Senator Manchin often gets a lot of focus and attention,
Yes.
but there are, a lot of Democrats who want to have input on this legislation, who may not support it in its current form. Listen, for instance, have a lot of changes that I want made to this legislation. So we're all sort of sitting in a room right now trying to get Republicans to buy in, but ultimately of the mind that our constituents back home who care about climate don't necessarily care too much about process. They just want to get something done. They want to get America leading again when it comes to issues of climate and job creation and infrastructure rebuilding.
Senator Murphy, you mentioned the issue of China and the sort of bipartisan consensus on the need to sort of address China and the competition with China. How does that play into the idea of the fact that we need China for cooperation in tackling climate change? Is there a risk that there might have to be a trade-off to get China to the table on addressing climate change on issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Uyghurs? Like, how do you manage both competition with China and the need for cooperation on climate change?
Well, listen, the relationship is obviously complicated, nuanced, fraught with peril. But I think the Chinese government understands that it has an independent interest in pursuing climate policy, that it is very hard to continue to attract investment with the pollution rates that have plagued the country over the last 20 years. They clearly see economic benefit to being able to be a center for manufacturing for the green energy economy. And so, well, yes, this is a country that is still building a lot of dirty power sources, still importing a lot of coal and oil from other parts of the world. They've got their own interests. They've got their own reasons to be at the table. No doubt we should be willing to trade and to compromise on fundamental issues of national sovereignty or human rights. I don't think we should be willing to trade. The downside of climate is enormous, but the downside of compromising national boundaries and borders and international norms is also significant as well. So I think we just have to be transparent about what we're willing to compromise on and what we aren't.
So you're not concerned when the Chinese foreign minister last week essentially implies that cooperation might be smoother if the United States did not sort of meddle in China's internal affairs? You think that there is enough sort of mutual need to address this issue that it's not going to lead to sort of policy compromises in Washington? Well,
again, I think there's area for compromise. Taiwan to me is not an area of compromise. But I think the Chinese are clearly going to do everything they can, especially as they see a Biden administration that is able to focus on more than one issue with China. Right? For 4 years, the Trump administration could only focus on trade. They had no bandwidth to deal with China on North Korea or human rights or Taiwan or climate. The Biden administration can walk and chew gum at the same time. That's frightening to the Chinese. And so the Chinese, of course, are going to try to tell us to stay out of their business. By the way, the Chinese get involved in our business all the time. The level of espionage and cyber attack, of misinformation and propaganda that the Chinese sort of send into our system is dizzying. And so we should go into these sort of this new relationship with China under the Biden administration with eyes wide open about how involved they are in our own political dynamics.
Senator Murphy, I want to ask you about a potential sort of U.S. credibility gap on the issue of climate change. I mean, you really talk about the need for America to regain leadership. How important was it for the U.S. to go back into the Paris Climate Accords? And how do we sort of regain the trust of the international community that we're serious about this and that we won't potentially reverse course in 4 years if there's a new administration?
Well, listen, I think it's a real risk, and it's a question, as you know, that in particular our European partners are asking right now. I think it has been harder than we had hoped to sort of just drop ourselves back into the transatlantic alliance, because many of our best friends in Europe are asking that same question. Listen, we'd love to put together a common climate architecture with the United States, but what guarantees do we have that there isn't going to be a dramatic shift back to climate denial in 4 years. So I think that's why I sort of come back to the conversation we were having before. I think it's incumbent upon Congress to try to continue to make down payments on bipartisan climate policy over the next 4 years, such that even if a Republican is in the White House 4 years from now, that it's just much harder for them to go back to a position of climate denial, that there is just much more warmth inside the Republican Party for a Republican president that wants to stay in Paris, wants to lead, even if it's in a different way than President Biden did. So I think we need to do our work on bipartisan climate policy.
I want to switch gears a little bit to the other sort of really big issue for the Biden administration in terms of how you tackle the COVID-19 crisis. Has that sort of in any way impacted the effort to formulate a global coordinated response to climate change? Are there sort of trade-offs?
Well, I mean, I think that this administration views climate as existential, and I think they understand the clock that exists here. I've got 2 kids at home, 12 and 9, who should not have to be as conscious as they are about how we could potentially rob from them the ability to continue to address this problem if we don't make big changes very quickly. So I think that the Biden administration is not particularly interested in sort of making big concessions or trade-offs here, because they're of the mind that if they don't make progress, both domestically and internationally, in the next 4 years, it might be too late.
So now I'm going to go to the audience for questions. And we had a question about how will the funds for combating climate change internationally under the jobs plan be allocated? Sort of what agencies will be responsible for allocating it? Will it be the Department of Energy, USAID? Sort of how will the infrastructure of government work to address these global issues?
Well, I don't think we know the answer to that question yet, because we are in the middle of trying to workshop this legislation and bring it through committee. I think there will not be one single answer. I think you'll sort of see a structure through the Millennium Challenge Grant where climate matters more. The Development Finance Corporation will be focusing on climate. We obviously want to populate the Green Climate Funds with significant resources that can be spent in partnership with other nations and private sector players. So I don't think that there will be one place in which climate funds are spent internationally. I think you will see additional resources throughout the U.S. foreign policy toolkit, and more of the focus in each of those buckets on good climate policy.
So I have another question. This is about the intersection of climate change, national security, and the efforts to empower women. How do you see these issues all interplaying?
Well, I mean, listen, we have made a real commitment that, especially in fragile nations, especially in nations that have endemic conflict, we are going to lift up the voices of women and make sure that they are sitting at the table. And what we know is that women are increasingly the heads of economic households. They are increasingly most connected to the impact of climate on economic security. And so if women are at the table, then it is much more likely that they can speak from experience as to what the impact of status quo on climate is to them and their families. So if you want a real authentic economic voice talking about the impact of climate at the table in discussions around the world, then you need women at the table. And so there's no doubt that these conversations are linked.
Senator Murphy, our time together is drawing to a close, but I wanted to ask you, sort of in conclusion, what gives you the most optimism that the U.S. is going to, reclaim this leadership on the global stage on the fight against climate change? And what are you most concerned about that could sort of block that effort?
Listen, what makes me most optimistic is young people. There's no great social change movement in this country that hasn't been led by young people, and young people are turning out in our elections at record numbers, and they've made it clear that if you're not right on climate, if you're not a champion and a leader on climate, we're not interested in supporting you. And so that's, not coincidental to the fact that more Republicans are interested in working on this, because as young people age, they are seeing a bigger portion of their electorate forcing them to care about climate. That is most encouraging. What is scariest to me is the impact of dark money. In the United States, we allow for corporations to spend billions of dollars without any transparency to affect our politics, to push people into our court system. Much of that money comes from the oil and gas industry, and they are using it not just to elect people to Congress, but to get people put on the Supreme Court that may end up taking away, through constitutional interpretation, the ability of Congress to regulate carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. So I think dark money, the impact of oil and gas money on our politics, it worries me. I think in the end, though, the power of those young people, especially as they age into the electorate, ultimately wins out.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Murphy, for this terrific discussion today. We look forward to reading more of your fantastic articles in Foreign Policy magazine. So thank you so much. I'm now going to introduce our next session moderator, Elise Labott. Elise is a columnist for Foreign Policy and most often reports on US foreign policy and international affairs. She has reported from more than 80 countries and interviewed and traveled the world with 7 secretaries of state. Today, she'll be continuing the conversation from Capitol Hill with 2 members of the House of Representatives. Welcome, Elise. What do you have for us next?
Still a year after COVID, still getting used to the unmute button.
Yes.
You'd think in television I would have learned that already. But anyway, thank you. It's great to be with you. It was great to get that national and global perspective from Senator Murphy. And now we're going to continue the discussion and go continue the national and global discussion, but also go a little local into the states. This morning, I have the pleasure to introduce 2 members of the House and chat with them about their perspective on President Biden's goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, their feedback on the Earth Day summit last week, and key climate challenges and initiatives in their home state. I'd like to welcome Congresswoman Kathy Castor from Florida. She's a member of the chair, actually, of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And I also want to welcome Congressman Garrett Graves from Louisiana. He's the ranking member of that Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and also the ranking member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Aviation. I'd like to remind the audience to submit their questions, all of those logged in to our event platform at foreignpolicy.com/events. Remember to submit your questions via the question box below. Chime in on social media. We're at hashtag FP Climate Summit. We'll continue to our view now from the policy perspectives. Congresswoman, Congressman, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Congresswoman, let me start with you. Last week, President Biden convened 40 world leaders in a bid to ramp up the new commitments to lower greenhouse gas emissions and step up efforts to help the developing world tackle the climate crisis. What were your takeaways from the summit? Do we have the Congresswoman?
I think the president's comments maybe made her speechless.
She's not on yet. Well, Congressman, the floor is yours. Talk to me about your perceptions. The early bird gets the worm, as they say. Talk to me about your perceptions of the summit. 40 leaders, obviously a big commitment to talking about these targets. What were your takeaways from the summit?
Yeah, Elise, thanks. Number one, I really appreciate the fact that there's this global interaction. There has to be a global dialogue. I commend the President and Secretary Kerry for continuing to push that global dialogue. So I think that is really good. I have strong concerns, however, with how some countries are being treated in regard to their commitments under the accords. And for example, if you look back just over the last several years, the United States has led the world in reducing emissions. But as you know, this is a global issue. And so if only the United States and a handful of other countries are reducing emissions and other countries are moving the other direction, then we may not have a net reduction in emissions. And under this reformulated Paris Accord, we're going to continue to see an increase in global emissions. That's not the right direction. So that does concern me. The second concern I have is the lack of specificity in how the United States is going to meet this goal that is pretty bold. And so I think it's important that we provide details to the American people, to the Congress, on how we're going to hit those commitments. So I'll say it again, Elise, I'm excited that there's a global dialogue, and I appreciate the efforts of the administration to work together with other countries. But we need an agreement that results in net reductions in emissions, and we need to talk a bit about making sure we have the right commitments among nations and understanding how the U.S. will hit such aggressive goals.
I want to talk about the U.S. goals in a second, but let's keep it global. Okay, so South Korean President Moon pledged to end public financing of coal-fired power plants. Unclear what that means within his own country. He is yet to set his revised targets for 2030 emissions. Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged also to limit the use of coal over the next 5 years and reduce emissions from coal. But when it comes to his Belt and Road Initiative, stops short of the more sweeping and kind of crucial commitments to end coal finance. And Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, also no new commitments. They're the fourth largest emitter. And he kind of pledged to significantly limit. Now, of course, the US kind of reemergence as a climate leader has invigorated the debate. But as we know, it's not just about numbers on a page. It's about understanding how to, make good use of those numbers and holding countries to account. As you say, while the US is making these ambitious targets and kind of regulations to go along with it, under other countries, it seems like numbers on a page sometimes.
It's a really good point. It is. And in fact, for example, on the HFCs that China was out telling the world that they stopped emitting or producing, we had satellites showing these extraordinary emissions coming out of China of HFC. So on the one hand, saying they weren't emitting, on the other hand, we were able to trace really extraordinary concentrations coming out of their country. So that you're right, we've got to make sure that we have the right verification or accountability on these commitments. The other thing, Elise, that I think it's important to keep in mind, in some cases, folks will come out, and you mentioned South Korea, and talk about specific energy technologies and how we're going to stop using this or stop using that. The most important thing I think we have to stay focused on, the real goal here, is the emissions. And if we can find ways to use conventional energy sources that our infrastructure is built for today, but do it in a way that rivals or even beats some renewable energy technologies in regard to emissions, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'll give a quick example. There are energy technologies today where we're able to produce industry scale electricity from natural gas, but partnered or complemented with emissions sequestration technology, to where you're producing electricity from natural gas, net zero emissions, and at market prices. And this is it's a less expensive option because we already have the compatibility of infrastructure. And something importantly, to be self-interested in the United States is we have an abundance of these resources. So I do think it's important that we continue innovating with all energy technologies that we have available to us.
Well, fortunately, we have Congresswoman Kathy Castor, the chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Congresswoman, thank you so much. Glad you can make it. We were just talking about the climate summit and some of the pledges that were made, but the congressman raised an interesting idea on infrastructure. And I know that that's something that's been very important in your home state. You've been helping efforts in Florida communities to recover from some lasting impacts of, say, the BP Deepwater Horizon oil disaster, and now this Piney Point, and the climate impacts of not repairing infrastructure and the need to kind of invest in infrastructure is a climate imperative.
You bet it is. And we understand that every dollar you invest in infrastructure, you get back a $6 return. The United States of America has allowed its infrastructure to crumble for too long. We haven't had the type of investment that we need for this modern, dynamic country that we're fortunate to live in. But now we're at a point where the climate crisis has reached such a moment of peril for us that we can combine those efforts to, as the president says, build back better, but really, just as you said, the Leaders Summit brought a reinvigoration to the global dialogue and action on climate. We've got to do it here in the United States of America. We have been the world leader in research and development and innovation, and we've got to continue down that path. The linchpin is the clean energy sector, ramping up renewables, strengthening our transmission. Look at the catastrophe that happened in Texas where we lost lives, and whoever would have envisioned a deep freeze in the deep South. But that came from the fact that they did not make their electric grid more resilient. So we intend to invest there. We intend to bring modern technology to our electric grid. We've got to connect up a lot of those renewable resources. And the good news is that when we do that, that'll put money back into consumers' pockets and improve their health and help us reach our very ambitious climate goals now that President Biden has established a new nationally determined contribution level of saying we're going to reduce our carbon pollution by 50 to 52% by 2030. This is very ambitious, and it's an all hands on deck moment.
Congressman, I want to ask you about the targets in a second, but just to finish the point that the Congresswoman was saying about infrastructure, and we could get into the economic benefits a little later, but I know being from the home state of Louisiana, and we had Katrina and the need to kind of repair dams and levees, it does seem as if repairing infrastructure does, there are climate imperatives to making sure that our infrastructure is solid to be able to withstand some of these climate emergencies.
Congresswoman Castor is exactly right in the need to invest in infrastructure. This is an area that's been underinvested in for decades, and an area where she and I enjoy working together is on resilience. We both represent coastal districts, and those are some of the most at-risk communities in the United States. And so working on infrastructure together is, again, an area where we enjoy working together, where we have a lot of common views and a lot of interest from home. And there's no doubt that building on some of the investments in resilience and adaptation is so important. As a matter of fact, just 3 years ago, we made some of the largest investments in American history in resilience and in adaptation measures. We made fundamental changes in disaster policy where we're being more proactive in preventing disasters from happening in Florida, in Louisiana. And this was under President Trump. And so certainly bipartisan support for these concepts. We I think have a lot of ground to cover and a lot of opportunity ahead of us. Where I think we're going to start having differences of opinion is sort of the definition or bounds of infrastructure. I think the more we can focus on resilience, the more we can focus on interstates, roads, bridges, traffic solutions, and things along those lines, we're going to be on the same page. But if we expand too much, then I'm concerned we're not going to be able to do it all, and we're going to have a fail across the board rather than being able to actually deliver some great wins in these areas of roads, bridges, traffic, and resilience.
Still want to get to those targets, but you bring up the point of resilience, which is something I think about a lot. And we have a question from our audience from Nepal, and being both from coastal states, how do you see the bigger perspectives of the water, energy, and food nexus in the context of climate resilience? Congresswoman, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. You know, we understand that when it comes to clean energy and climate, the answer simply cannot be funding resilience measures. We have to get to the heart of the matter, and that is reducing carbon pollution. And don't just take it from me, take it from the largest insurers in the world. According to Swiss Re, just last week, they're the major global insurance giant. They warned that the climate crisis could cost the world up to $23 trillion every year by 2050, reducing global economic output by up to 14%. That's why clean energy and the ramp up of renewables and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels is probably the most critical thing we can do when it comes to resilience planning. But we have got to do this because the escalating costs of climate are really impacting us. Last year, just in the United States, we had 22 climate-fueled disasters. Each of those cost us more than $1 billion. Everyone remembers the wildfires in California, flooding in the Midwest, these more intense hurricanes that so rapidly intensified. We ran out of names. We had to go into the Greek alphabet. And the similar impacts are happening all across the globe. So yes, we intend to modernize and strengthen our infrastructure. That does include our food systems. We have to empower our farmers to be more efficient, to sequester carbon in the soil. And they are engaged. It's really an all hands on deck moment.
So Congressman, pick up on that, but also you've talked about the need for affordable and exportable targets that have global impact, which is to say that it needs to be able to be sustainable here in the US, and it needs to be a model that all could follow. It can't be something where the US is making all the kind of carbon reduction sacrifices and other countries, and we're compensating in effect for other countries.
Sure, and at least we talked about this at the beginning. You know, it's so important that we truly look at this through a global lens, which is why, you know, again, I appreciate this global engagement that the administration is doing. But for every 1 ton of emissions we've reduced in the United States, China has increased by 4. That's not moving in the right direction. And so what we've got to make sure that we focus on is technologies that are affordable. For example, in the state of California, that has moved very aggressively in attempting to move in a renewable energy technology direction, you've got impoverished groups, you've got minority groups that are suing the state because of the disproportionate impact of the extraordinary increase in electricity prices that again have a disproportionate or aggressive impact on the impoverished or some of these ethnic communities in the state of California. One operator alone, over I think the last 20 years, their rates have gone up nearly 60%. And so we've got to make sure that as we move forward, that these are technology transitions. And I have confidence in the innovators here that can produce solutions that are actually affordable. Let me give a quick example. There was legislation, about 12 years ago called Waxman-Markey that mandated reductions in emissions. It chose technological winners and losers and forced the market to renewable energy technology direction. What ended up happening, because it didn't become law, we exceeded the emissions reduction target just by letting innovators innovate, not manipulating markets. Letting innovators innovate, the new technologies reduced emissions beyond the target set by Waxman-Markey, and we did it at a fraction of the price predicted. So I have a lot of confidence that we can continue this global leading reduction in emissions here in the United States, but we've got to make sure we do it based on our resources and do it in a way that is affordable, because as you know, you'll never be able to export technological solutions in renewable energy that are going to increase costs 60% or even greater, as we've seen tripling of electricity rates in some areas, trying to force these new technologies that will not take or be absorbed in some developing nations.
Okay, now we're going to get into, there's a lot of common ground here, and now we're going to get into maybe a little bit where there might be disparities, but I still think the goals are the same, maybe even if the tactics aren't. Congresswoman, I know that you've touted the economic benefits of climate action, job creation. We're going to hear more tonight about the President's American Jobs Plan, investing about $2 trillion in jobs, you know, and that is also related to infrastructure that can, and as the congressman said as well, you know, build more climate resilience. Talk to me a little bit about that, being mindful of the concerns of this kind of overreaching on what infrastructure really means.
Well, the heart of the American Jobs Plan is putting folks to work all across the economy and to make sure that the benefits are shared by everyone across the country. And we see enormous benefits, particularly in the clean energy sector. And it was so interesting, Elise, last week, the United Mine Workers from coal country and Senator Capito from West Virginia even had made a similar remark that they understand that the coal production will not be the same over time, and they are looking forward to what the new industries will be. And there are enormous opportunities, not just plugging mines and plugging abandoned wells, things like that, but creating these new industries for electric vehicle manufacturing. We want to bring the solar panel industries back to the U.S. Business is in partnership with us. I mean, it's been remarkable to watch the American automakers say, yes, they're going all electric. Watching electric vehicle or electric school buses, electric transit buses, open new plants here. That's why there is a role here of, and I'm going to be very interested in what President Biden says tonight about more detail on that strategy, because we do think we can create millions and millions of jobs, and it will come at a very important time as we're digging out of the COVID-induced economic crisis.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. That was so fast, but I just want to, Congressman, I want to get to you on this issue, and then, you know, maybe we'll just close on a few closing thoughts about COVID and whether, you know, we saw how the planet kind of regenerated itself in the last year and whether there's any optimism there, what we can learn from that. But Congressman, there has been this kind of traditional positioning of a traditional zero-sum game. It's either like we focus on the climate and we're going to suffer economically, or we're going to be able to use the economy to spur building climate resilience.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and I think that there's some great examples out there where you can see what happens when you move in a direction that may be uninformed or not following what we've seen in history. Look, the reality is, if you just go out and you go develop technologies like more advanced solar panels or wind turbines or what have you, history has shown very clearly that technology gets pirated, and you do create jobs. It's just not in the United States. It ends up creating jobs.
Well, that's an intellectual property issue, but still,
it is. But it's very applicable to what we're talking about here in regard to jobs, because you can't just say, well, we created new technology, so now the jobs are going to be grounded in the United States. That's not what happens. You end up getting the pirated technology manufactured in other countries. The U.S. ultimately loses. I'll give you a quick example. We just had a huge solar farm that was proposed in South Louisiana, and the local government actually rejected tax incentives because they came back and the company promised one contract job, one. And they said, look, this isn't helpful for our economy. And so if we can develop the clean energy solutions that are based upon U.S. resources, that ensures that we ground the jobs here, so we can have the win-win of reduced emissions, but ensuring job creation here in the United States. And it also meets that test of affordable, exportable energy solutions that truly chart a course toward hitting these aggressive emissions targets that the United States and other countries have set. So I think it's really important that we do that. and that we're moving in a direction that's informed by facts and not out there just inventing numbers on the number of jobs that will be created when we know exactly what's going to happen.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. We could certainly go on a lot more, and I invite you both back to talk about how we can do that. But that does kind of fit into our next panel. Congresswoman Castor, Congressman Graves, thank you so much for being here. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Elise.
Thanks so much.
Next up, I'd like to introduce a group of experts to address the pressure of the oil and gas sector and faces in not only meeting decarbonization targets while the demand continues to grow, but all of the talk that we just went on to about innovation and developing solutions that are affordable and exportable. Joining me on the virtual stage are Sverre Alvik, the Energy Transition Research Director at DNV, Cynthia Quarterman, a Distinguished Energy Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Michael Rubio, the General Manager of ESG and Sustainability at Chevron. Everybody, thank you for joining me. All right, well, let's dig in. Let's all unmute our lines and let's explore how the oil and gas industry can evolve in ways that align with market and political realities and not only support, but perhaps lead efforts toward a carbon neutral energy future. What's possible, what's needed from government and industry. Let's dive in. Sverre, let's start with you. I read the DNV Energy Transition Outlook that looks out to 2050, and it was really fascinating for me about a few of the takeaway projections about crude oil use and CO2 emissions. They peaked last year because of COVID. Obviously, that was an inflection point, but you point out in this outlook that future declines are nowhere near enough to meet the Paris Agreement. So talk to me about that.
Thank you. Yes. That is right. We have made an forecast from our side, which is not the future we want, but the future we think is about to happen with the expected policies, the expected technology developments, and the expected economic developments. And in that, there is obviously room for oil and gas. And we say that this future is a 2.3 degree future. So it's not business as usual, but it's not the Paris Agreement future we set out to. And in this future, we see that oil and gas is moving from the present 55% of the world's energy to a 45% in 2050, meaning there is ample room for oil and gas. And the problem, though, is that this is not a development which is fast enough. So if we are to meet the Paris Agreement, we need to be even tougher on the measures in order to further increase the growth of renewables and curb the growth of or speed up the decline of fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and gas. That doesn't mean going to zero, but it means having stricter measures than we have today.
Well, put this into perspective for people. Because obviously there's a difference between what's desirable, as we've spoken about, and what's aspirational and what's achievable and on the track we're actually on.
Yes. So a business as usual world will lead us to continue to increase oil, gas, coal, along with renewables. But energy transition is what's needed, not energy addition. I mean, as long as you just put the solar and wind on top of an increasing demand for gas and oil and petrol, or gas and oil and coal, we won't have any decrease in emissions. So we need to replace some of the oil and gas with renewable investments. And that can be done, and it started, but it's a long way to get there.
So Michael, let's talk about what industry is doing to support the development of transparency and accessible metrics. I saw an interesting climate lobbying report that Chevron put out. A lot of times people aren't kind of transparent about where the industry is going. But I think oil companies now are working from a place that the future of energy is lower carbon, and that industry can play an active role and an open dialogue about how to shape solutions for cleaner energy.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up, Elise. And I'm glad someone read that report. A lot of resources and effort goes into it. But we are, and you just hit the nail on the head, I think. We all know that the future is lower carbon. And at Chevron being headquartered in California, I think it gives us a bit of a competitive advantage, where one could say the environmental movement in the domestic United States started here on the West Coast. And so I would add what Spira was just saying a second ago. We've got to find a way to lower the carbon intensity globally. And not only do we need to make investments to shift from fossil fuel resources to renewable, but we have to come together and find a way how we can lower the carbon intensity of a resource for which billions of people use today. And so at Chevron, if you look at our energy transition to advance the lower carbon future, we are really focusing on lowering the carbon intensity of our base business. We're going to do that together with governments, with key stakeholders. So we lay it out with full transparency in our climate lobbying report, as well as our climate resiliency report that's aligned with the TCFD and indexed to SASB today. Secondly, we're looking to increase the use of renewables to there again lower the carbon intensity of our base business. And then at the same time, our third action area is to invest in breakthrough technologies, because we want to know, or we do know, and history tells us, that there's going to be new technologies. And those technologies are going to be lower carbon, whether it's hydrogen or carbon capture and utilization and storage. So we're looking at all three of those in a broad spectrum. We're going to invest over $3 billion between now and 2028. And Alicia, you would ask yourself and ask me why 2028 is such an important number for us. We've aligned all of our greenhouse gas reduction targets and efforts with the government's 5-year assessment cycle that's put into the Paris Agreement, otherwise known as the stocktake. So we're aligning ourselves with government activity. It's so important. We think that we're part of the solution, not part of the problem. Again, because billions of people use this resource today, not only for mobility, but for hot showers and hot food. And so we think it's important to do it.
So Cynthia, as a prior energy regulator in the Obama administration, how do you think the oil and gas industry can be involved in this transition going forward? And from a regulatory and policy perspective, how can the government either help accelerate that, ease the pain, and looking at what other countries are doing, what can the US do going forward?
Good morning, Elise. Thanks for having me here, you and the Foreign Policy magazine. And it's fun to be with this distinguished panel. President Biden said recently that climate change is the existential crisis of our times. I would say it's also the existential crisis for the oil and gas industry. The oil and gas industry does have a role to play in solving climate change. I'm so glad that Michael said that as well. It has to be a part of the solution going forward, not only for itself, but for the world at large. It's clear to me that in the very short term, as Spear said, the world is going to need to continue to rely on fossil fuels and pave a way to a clean energy future. From a foreign policy perspective, energy has been one of the most important, if not the most important factor in national security for time immemorial. As the world moves away from fossil fuels and toward a cleaner energy, oil and gas companies, they must meet that short-term demand for fossil fuels. And in order to continue to operate in the long term, I think that they must be prepared to transition to pure energy companies. A clear message from the international community, federal and state governments, regulators, investors, shareholders, boards of directors, consumers, society at large, is that to continue to operate, oil and gas companies must deliver climate solutions. Now, how can they do that? I think that there are 3 things that oil and gas companies need to do to stay relevant, and regulators are going to be a big part of that, and must be. First and foremost, they need to markedly decrease their greenhouse gas emissions. That means they need to stop, limit, minimize flaring and venting CO2 and methane. They need to detect greenhouse gas leaks and repair them as soon as feasible. They need to create, support, and utilize all sorts of new technology, equipment, software that will help stop the release of greenhouse gases into the environment. Those actions will also lower the cost for them and the environment and the financial, and improve their company's efficiency and competitiveness across the board. Second, they need to identify and use decarbonizing energy sources within their existing business models, so that they are lowering their own emissions. They need to do that through alternative energy sources, through new technologies, through renewable resources, electrical vehicles, everything that they can that is less polluting in their main business. A lot of the things that Michael mentioned. Third, they need to invest in the future, in decarbonizing energy sources such as battery storage, CCS, electric vehicle charging stations and infrastructure, advanced biofuels, wind, solar, hydrogen, you name it. That's in order to diversify for themselves and secure their own businesses in the future. It's clear that both the policy mandates and the expectations of shareholders and the public and investors is that this change happen. So regulators have a huge role to play. I've regulated 2 energy organizations, both in the Clinton and the Obama years. And off the bat, I will say that energy regulators have a lot of control. Of course, it's based in the existing law, but the laws tend to be broad. And as regulators, they can set standards for emissions, which we're seeing in the past and probably in the future, for what kind of equipment should be used within infrastructure, what are the best practices, follow those best practices. All those pieces of the regulatory toolkit that are available will probably be used and will have to be used, but it doesn't all have to be sticks. It can be carrots as well. And I think it must be.
Mm-hmm. Sverre, so Cynthia brought up renewables, battery storage, and you say that, renewables still only cover about 11% of the world's energy supply. Despite the renewable surge, the kind of deep carbonization we're talking about is 15 years away because the technologies to decarbonize are yet to take off, and they really need to be kind of accelerated so the energy transition can scale sooner.
That is right. And if you look at the broader energy transition, I think we could first separate between what can be electrified and what can not be electrified. So first you should electrify whatever can be electric. And that includes buildings, it includes cars, it includes parts of lighter industry and all that. And then you're left, and in that electricity, gas has a role to play, but over time, a more limited role to play. Then there are things that cannot be electrified easily. You talk about ships, long distance airplanes, high temperature manufacturing processes, for example. And then you need to decarbonize those in another way. Hydrogen typically have a key role in this. Carbon capture and storage also has a key role in this. And in here, we see that gas has a major role to play, and then in the form of decarbonized gas. So the energy transition is first about electrifying what can be electric, and then to decarbonize the remaining sectors by other means.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, if I want to follow up a little bit on what Cynthia said, the industry typically talk about something they call scope 1, 2, and 3. And scope 1 is their own production emissions. Scope 2 is the supply chain, and scope 3 are the products themselves. And there are different strategies for each of these 3. For your own product emissions, we talk about making a more effective production of oil and gas. So, for example, reducing flaring, as was said here, to replace gas turbines with electricity powering the exploration and production, etc. For the supply chain, it's about how to effectively move your products to the consumer and what sort of power you use, for example. And then for the products themselves, you can of course replace the scope 3, meaning you can of course replace some of the oil and gas with other sources, but you can also be more effective in the way you use them. For example, energy efficiency of a car engine. You can improve that so that the car uses less petrol every time you are driving.
So Michael, we're talking about this kind of deep carbonization, which could really transform the oil and gas industry into the decarbonizer of, and the world supplier of carbon capture and storage. But it doesn't look like this will happen until the costs have come down, where a carbon price exceeds the cost of the technology. So how does the gas industry prepare for an energy system that doesn't really accept the release of carbons and accelerate that technology and energy transition so that it could scale sooner, as we're talking about?
It's a large question. I'll unpack it through a couple different means, Elise. I think first and foremost, you're going to have to look to the resiliency and the adaptability of a company, and look at both the financial strengths and the organizational capabilities and the governance of a company to anticipate both the risks and the opportunities that are going to come to bear in this energy transition. Chevron's been around for 140 years. We've been through many energy transitions. The first product we ever created was a more affordable, a more reliable, and ever cleaner product called kerosene to replace well oil at the time. And so we're on that journey again. I'd really like to emphasize something that Cynthia brought up, though, because I think she really is on point on a particular front. In order to choose the winners in this space, you're going to have to be able to compare company to company, company A to company B. And right now, we don't have that ability. And so what I mean by that is if a company says they're lowering their greenhouse gas emissions to what Sphere said on, say, scope 1 and 2, then you should be able to look at their report and say, okay, they have a 35% reduction target. But some companies are doing it only on an operated basis versus an equity basis. And today, Chevron's the only company to issue greenhouse gas metrics and targets in our sector that are based on equity. So if we have a financial interest in a business unit, we're going to account for those emissions. And then second, we're also doing it on a commodity approach. So we're looking to lower the carbon intensity of both oil and gas since it's needed today. I would say, Sphere, both are going to be needed on an electric vehicle. You're going to need gas to generate the electricity today, and it will transition. But where a lot of people are surprised when they learn how much petroleum products go into making the EV vehicle itself. It still needs tires, it still needs carbon fiber to make it lighter, and good luck mining the material that goes into batteries without fossil fuel. And so, this is where a partnership needs to come together, and we're all in this as global citizens, global companies, to find the solutions. But people, investors, markets, regulators are going to be able to, they have to be able to measure companies side by side. And that's where we think, and we're really working at the global level and within the United States to develop those standards. So both key stakeholders, regulators, influencers, the markets could have the transparency and the information they need to make the decisions to help move forward everyone's effort to reach the Paris Agreement.
Well, and then you've also pointed out that, there are very high subsidies in countries like Japan and Germany and others to make it work. But many of the kind of technologies here are not getting the same kind of support, and the cost is much higher. And you need to kind of solve that conundrum between a mandate and incentivize, as Cynthia said.
Yeah, it's very true. We promote a price on carbon. I think that's the most effective way, we believe, to get to the scope 3 or the end consumer emission that Sphere referenced earlier. And so when you do that, it enables three things. One, by making it the primary policy approach, you're able to take a broader, more equal, economy-wide effort that ultimately will aid the market to be able to participate in this transition. But when we talk about the policy, the one thing I would highlight is the shared benefits. Whatever is done has to spur innovation, and it has to mitigate the harm to consumers. Now, being headquartered in California, as we've been working on many of these policies, we have found, if not done right, and I think it was mentioned in the panel just before us, it could have unintended consequences of impacting consumers who drive more to get to work, who live in an area that have to rely on their air conditioner even at 11 o'clock at night. You know, not everybody has the joy of living along the coast where it's cool. And so their energy use is a lot higher. And so when we look at the policy approach, we do think that the price on carbon is the most effective way. We have a history in helping pass one in the state of California, one of the largest prices on carbon in the world for that matter. And so, but subsidies are going to be needed. We've seen it today in renewable natural gas, in electric vehicles. We're going to need it in carbon capture and utilization and storage, which is going to be part of the solution as well. And we just work with policymakers to move forward the policies that are needed to advance this energy transition that we're in.
Cynthia, let's talk about how policy can support, and industry too, help facilitate workforce development and retraining to move workers from fossil fuel to renewable energy jobs and uplift communities in that transition.
I think that's a key question, and one that the administration has been trying to address. If you saw on day 2, everything was about jobs, 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 because that is, I think, what the public is thinking about. When they think of foreign policy in general, in the past, they have thought about trade, and there's a lot of resistance to the notion of jobs going outside of the United States or outside of any country. Every country is now suffering the same harm. So I think the focus has to be on how can our foreign policy help us domestically. One important thing that we haven't mentioned, we've got big companies like Chevron and the other international oil companies all stepping up, not all, but many of them stepping up to do their piece. We have to remember that they have a small piece in the energy puzzle. You've got national oil companies that carry the biggest amount of burden on it when we are talking about climate change. Now, some of those countries are stepping forward, and that's wonderful. But you've also got a big chunk of people who are just mom and pop independent operators, at least in the United States, and I think in other countries, who are going to be struggling, trying to figure out, okay, where do we fit in this climate change puzzle? Will they be willing to move their investment away from what they're accustomed to in oil and gas towards something entirely different like solar? So we have to figure out how those people are also engaged in this process. And that's where government comes in. Government comes in and says, this is not just an energy sector or environmental sector problem. This is a problem, an issue that's so complicated it touches every piece of government, which is what you see happening now. We need to go into every regulatory agency and with a fine-tooth comb to figure out who will be affected, whether it's farmers or the agriculture piece, who's going to be affected by this, and how can we make a change that will help them. We don't want those mom and pop operators to no longer be part of the economy. Government can help in the transition. You've heard lots of different jobs that will be out there, not just the new EV infrastructure. There'll be capping, for example, pipeline infrastructure if we go to hydrogen to deal with that. All those are things that government can play a role in helping along the way. We've seen great targets. We need a plan.
Quick question from the audience, Cynthia.
Yes.
Talk to me about the difference between executive action and what needs congressional action, do you think?
Well, executive action, I think we've seen the full force of executive action so far. The administration has come in and it seems to me they have looked through every piece of the government that they can think of, and maybe there's some that they're hidden that they haven't gotten to yet, to say, what should we be doing? Okay, the executive puts that forward, and its agencies can then move on those mandates. However, if there are stumbling blocks in the way because of existing laws, that is where Congress comes in, and that becomes the real issue, I think, in moving forward with some of these efforts. To what extent will Congress, with such a small Democratic Senate majority, how much change can we really expect for them to make in this period of transition? Now, regulators have, in my view, pretty broad authorities in existing laws and can press forward with what they want to do under the existing laws, but there are always going to be stumbling blocks along the way, and Congress has to remove those stumbling blocks, or, as we've seen in the past, replace them and add more blocks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to get to Michael on the jobs issue, but Sverre, question from the audience. Talk about, should natural gas, wind, and solar all be equal technology winners here, do you think? And kind of branch that out a little bit. We've talked about how, yes, it's not just about, industry or regulation, but also about kind of behavioral changes that we all need to make to transition to a better environmental footprint and reduce the temperature of the planet.
There is a big difference between renewable energy and gas, and oil and gas, and of course, when you use renewable energy, you don't emit. Well, oil and gas you do, except as Michael pointed out, the oil you use to make plastics and petrochemicals, which is not burned. 13% of the world's oil is not burned, but made into plastics. So no, they're not equal. Continued use of unabated oil and gas continues to release CO2 into the atmosphere, and we need to stop that at one time or the other. Otherwise, the temperature will continue to increase. So they're not equal, but they're all needed, at least for a long period, because a renewable or an electricity system only built on variable renewables is not stable, because the wind and solar doesn't produce on demand, but when you when the weather is there. So we do need stability in that system. In addition to the connectivity, the storage, and the demand response, we need some stable on-demand sources like gas, like hydropower, and other things. So they will stay there for a long time, but long term, 2040, 2050, we need to decarbonize it with carbon capture and storage, for example, if it's continued to be part of the energy mix.
So Michael, let's attack some of this perception that industry is not interested in clean jobs. There's this whole political context behind it. Can you unpack that in terms of, supporting workforce development, but also you've spoken about the need to be creative and find solutions in lowering the carbon intensity of the more difficult to abate industries. And I know you've learned a lot being in California. So kind of look at from a bigger picture of where the jobs are in transitioning.
Sure, Elise, and I think it's a really good question, and it dovetails nicely what Sverre was just talking about. We're going to need base load power, lower carbon base load power to support the intermittent power of wind and solar. We're looking at technologies today that deal with new geothermal, fusion, all of that I would consider to be a lower carbon job. And I think this, I'm a Democrat from California, and before I joined Chevron 10 years ago, it was the only thing that could be deemed a renewable job or green job was if you were in wind and solar. And I would just ask people to look beyond wind and solar and consider the other things that are going to be really important in this energy transition. When natural gas is talked about, it's often just in the form of generating an electron. But if we want to end world hunger and we want to move away from eating red meat because we know the impact on the climate it has, then we're going to move towards a plant-based diet. A lot of folks are surprised to learn that to generate a good chunk of the fertilizer today to grow food comes from natural gas. There are a lot of great beneficial uses that we get from natural gas that we need to be mindful of. And so people that are working in that space, creating the new technology, those are jobs that are really helping the global effort to reach that Paris Agreement. And so when we look at it, we're really proud of the scientists, the engineers. Chevron is worldwide, and so we're in fact sending employees to institutions like MIT, paid for as if they're still Chevron employees, to go there to get trained on artificial intelligence, new technologies. And then when they're done with that master's program, they come back and they share those learnings and advance the company even further as we work towards a lower carbon future. And so we see there being lots of opportunity here, but asking individuals and asking all those involved to look at the broad spectrum of those that are going to be participants, I think is key, and just not considering a green job to be someone who's producing or working on a wind turbine or a solar panel, I think is critical for the conversation.
Sverre, we have a question from the audience. I'm going to add to it a little about what type of setbacks you see for companies like Chevron and the agriculture industry moving away from gas and fuel. You've kind of said someone needs to go first and stop preparing for this deep decarbonization down the line, and kind of make it a reality today, because there would be a bright future after the transformation, but someone needs to start kind of putting the ball down the field.
Yeah, I mean, first movers are important here, and there are big differences. You have some oil and gas companies that have taken the whole step and moved out of oil and gas. Danish oil and gas became to Ørsted. They don't have nothing to do with oil and gas anymore. Most, they instead they diversify and they broaden their portfolios. And then of course you can effectivize what is left. And then you have some national oil companies or gas companies, I don't know, Gazprom and others, that might rather divest or slowly reduce their size. But yes, someone needs to move first. And there is a role for oil and gas in the decades to come. But if you are to reach the Paris Agreement, that role is reducing over time. And it's only, I mean, back to the previous question, is gas a destination fuel or is gas a bridge to something else? It is increasingly clear that if you are to decarbonize and have a carbon neutral future, it's a bridge in an unabated form, and you need to have to decarbonize it if it's to continue.
So Cynthia, you've talked about how decarbonization can be transformative, but you have to adjust the cost learning curve, increase the rollout of technology. The costs have to come down. And as we've talked about, until the carbon price exceeds the cost of the technology, these are still businesses. So how can government push the envelope in terms of accelerating the development of that technology?
Well, government has a very big role, in my view, in pushing things forward. You have now the Department of the Interior looking at whether or not to proceed or what to do with leasing on federal lands. The decision-making process there will push some companies to make changes in how they move forward. If as a regulator, I were to say, okay, as my former job as the head of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, I would say, okay, gas pipeline companies, the number of leaks that were permitted goes from X to Y, and Y is significantly lower. The technology is going to figure out a way to get it there. I mean, you can't do it overnight, obviously, but you can chart a course and make the market move with you. Of course, you can't just move the market. You also have to help the market along. You have to have incentives and tax breaks and tax credits to help people actually want to expedite those new technologies. So I think government has a big role in making this happen and encouraging companies to move forward. If you look, for example, at the offshore program, you see a lot of offshore wind projects happening. Where are all of the big oil companies there? More of them could be involved in that. Nobody knows the offshore better than the oil and gas companies. They can put up those big wind turbines and run those facilities in the future if they want to. There's so many options available. The natural gas pipeline industries, are they thinking about how to integrate hydrogen into their network? Those are all big questions that could be pushed by regulators to make them move forward a little bit quicker than they would otherwise.
We have a question, Sverre, from the, we're coming to a close, unfortunately. I want to ask a question of Sverre, and then Michael, I want to close with a question to you. Could you address the use, this is a question from our audience, the use of nuclear energy going forward, given that nuclear is currently the only proven baseload source of energy that has no CO2 emissions other than hydrogen? I don't know that to be true because that's a little bit above my science knowledge, but if you could address the use of nuclear energy.
Yeah, nuclear energy is renewable in the sense that it's not emitting CO2, and nuclear energy is a part of all IPCC 1.5 degree scenarios. And to reach 1.5 degree, it's very hard to see that you do that without increasing the use of nuclear. However, nuclear is expensive, it's often delayed, and there are risk awareness or risk perceptions of this that make some countries, Japan, Germany, and others, wanting to seize them. So if you look at the most cost-effective future, then nuclear is expensive. But if you are to reach 1.5 degree, you need also more nuclear, along with more wind and solar, as you said, for this base load there. So yes, we see a limited role of nuclear in a sort of cost-optimized future, but a larger role for nuclear in a Paris-compliant future.
Mm-hmm. I might add that we had foreign policy, our summit, we had a panel addressing nuclear energy yesterday on our first day of our climate summit. So I encourage anybody that's interested in the nuclear issue to check that out. Michael, we had an interesting discussion the other day about establishing a true global footprint through the value chain so that people know when they're ordering something on Amazon, for instance, you know, a hat, a pair of shoes, an airline ticket, anything you purchase, that you would know the carbon intensity, just like when you go to a grocery store or a restaurant and you know whether it's organic or you know the calorie level. Talk to me about whether you think that the market in the future and how far away we are of that, where the market will dictate that people are going to want to buy things or make their purchases based on a lower carbon footprint, and will that dictate the market in the future?
Elsie, I think Michael has left the live studio here.
Oh, Michael dropped off apparently. Cynthia, talk to me about that.
He's back.
Michael's back.
Oh, Michael, we got you?
Yeah, I thought it was something I said there, Elise. I apologize.
I was saying, I don't know if you heard me, but we had this, you were talking about something really interesting the other day about, you know, given a global footprint, what's the role of industry in terms of establishing a true global footprint through the value chain, so that when you make a purchase on Amazon or an airline ticket, you should know the carbon intensity. Just like when we go to a grocery store, we'll know if it's organic or not. And how do you think the market will respond to to that? Will the market dictate on that in the future?
We hope it will. I mean, if you think about the green premium that's talked about today, we think that the power resides within the consumer, and the market will respond well. We're all in this first and foremost as global citizens to reach the Paris Agreement. But, you know, everyone needs to know they need to be on a diet, if you will, to use the analogy, but everyone's not eating healthy right now. And so to a point I think Cynthia made earlier, you know, by developing the reporting framework, the standards, you know, we've been working on something called the carbon footprint effort. We've got an effort with a business in Singapore called Pavilion, where now every LNG cargo that comes in will have a carbon statement along with it. So they will be able to track the carbon intensity throughout the entire value chain. So at least to your point, when we're all traveling again in very robust ways and you're buying an airline ticket, you're not only making your decision based on the price, but also on the carbon intensity of that ticket. And we think when that happens, you're going to be able, the market will be able to reward those that are more efficient, those that are working towards the effort. And we think there's going to be winners and losers in this space. And, you know, that's how markets work. And so we hope ultimately it will get there. And in a partnership working with the Biden administration today and other leaders around the world, but certainly looking to get to that point where everyone knows the carbon intensity of the goods that they're buying today.
Well, it's fascinating. Cynthia, just very quickly, what do you think? I mean, we saw over the last year that the climate, everyone was kind of remarking on, you know, how we weren't really, you know, kind of abusing the environment for the past year, and the climate in a lot of ways regenerated itself. Do you think we're looking towards that kind of market approach going forward?
If I only had a crystal ball, I would hope so. But there's a lot of work to be done in the interim. There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Cynthia Korteman, Sverre Alvik, and Michael Rubio, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. I learned so much. For our next session, I'd like to introduce fellow journalist and my former colleague and friend at CNN, Maggie Lake. Maggie is a veteran journalist with over 2 decades of experience covering business, technology, politics, international affairs. She's interviewed the world's top CEOs, celebrities, politicians, and a constant champion of economic inclusion and sustainable development. So Maggie, you're going to be moderating a discussion on the importance of resilient capital, critical mineral supplies, and securing economic and environmental future. It sounds like it's going to be a fascinating discussion.
The mute button always gets us. Elise, so fantastic to see you again. Thank you for that intro and that fantastic discussion. The panel covered so much ground, so we hope to do the same with this one. Now, in this next panel, we are going to shed some light on another aspect of the green industrial revolution, the immensely important role technology metals play in the shift to clean energy, specifically how the world can secure the supply of the critical raw materials needed for the advanced technologies that will ultimately power energy efficient industries and transportation. Joining me now on our virtual stage will be Brian Minnell, the founder and chairman and CEO of TechMed. TechMed is a private company building world-class projects that produce, process, and recycle technology metals critical to electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, and energy storage. One of TechMed's largest shareholders is the United States International Development Finance Corporation. Also joining us, Anna Spitzberg, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation at the Department of State. Ms. Spitzberg is responsible for supporting a shift to a decarbonized economy that enables secure and resilient energy systems. Additionally, she leads U.S. representation at the International Renewable Energy Agency and other bilateral and multilateral engagements on energy with U.S. allies and partners. And finally, Dr. Fiona Wild, Vice President, Sustainability and Climate Change at BHP. She leads the design and implementation of BHP's climate change strategy. Among many other roles and accomplishments, Fiona served on the Financial Stability Board's task force on climate-related financial disclosures reporting to the G20. Task force recommendations serve as a template
for how financial and non-financial companies should disclose climate-related information to ensure financial risk can be better measured and managed. A very warm welcome. Before we begin, just a reminder to all of our viewers who logged in through the platform at foreignpolicy.com/events. Please submit your questions via the question box that appears below the video player on your screen. We absolutely want to hear from you, and I will try to work those questions in throughout the discussion. You can also add your voice on social media using the hashtag FPClimateSummit. Welcome, panelists, and thank you so much for being here today. Over the last week, we've heard ambitious global commitments to reduce carbon emissions, and yet we know that there's simply not enough supply of the metals currently that's needed to make this important pivot. Anna, I'd like to start with you, and I know the US government is in the midst of a supply chain review, so there may be some limits on what you're able to say, but has the Biden administration identified areas in the tech metal supply chain that are most vulnerable that need to be prioritized?
Well, in your mention of the 100-day review, you alluded to it, and that's that this review process was kicked off by an executive order on supply chains that was signed by President Biden about 2 months ago. And the order singles out semiconductors, high-capacity batteries, critical minerals, and pharmaceuticals and PPE. So it does wean in on those, and it directs federal agencies to identify the risks and solutions. Once the order is complete, we'll be able to get into more specifics. But one thing that I think is worth noting is that President Biden committed to reduce emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030 compared to our 2005 levels in our new NDC. And energy is the main culprit when it comes to emissions. Therefore, we know that electric vehicles and batteries for storage and solar and wind are going to need to scale at an unprecedented rate to meet these obligations, and that the supply chains, like you mentioned, and the key minerals will need to match that. And so those that are in high demand for those technologies, so class 1 nickel, cobalt, lithium, graphite, and those found in permanent magnets will be very important. And we've already seen external studies, at least, including those by the World Bank, that highlight that a number of these minerals and metals will be stressed under a 2-degree scenario, with some needing to increase by more than 500% in the next 3 decades, which means this is all amplified in that 1.5-degree warming scenario that we're trying to limit to. And we also know that only a limited number of countries mine these minerals. It takes a good chunk of time to start up a mine, and the price volatility is a constraint to investment. So we'll have much more detail in another 30 days, but these are some of the pieces that are looming, and the reason that there's so much attention on creating resilience around supply chains so that we can actually achieve our goals.
And certainly one of those alone would be challenging. The scope of that is daunting. I mean, increasing by 500%. Brian, how does the world meet this expected demand and surge, especially given that we know the US and Europe can't compete on cost when it comes to China? So what is the business model to domesticate or at least to decouple from China's dominance here?
I think, Maggie, the key issue is not China. China, we should certainly admire and appreciate and respect what they've achieved in the space, and their dominance over the supply pipeline of these key strategic materials is an enormous national security and geopolitical issue. But a bigger issue, and the most immediate and pressing challenge we will have to face, is how to scale and transform our industry to adequately supply this clean, sustainable energy revolution. And that will require multiples of the global present production of all of these key metals and metal chemicals. And to achieve that, we have to totally transform our industry. We need higher prices for the metals to incentivize projects that will produce on a larger scale quickly. We need a whole nother level of bilateral, multilateral government agency support and assistance in order for our industry to transform adequately. And in my view, we need, if we go back to the China elements of the equation, we need a US-led global Marshall Plan to coordinate and drive and mobilize all public sector, private sector support and financing in order to achieve a goal which is monumental. I mean, I don't think one can exaggerate how transformative we have to be in our metals and mining industry in order to meet the challenge of supplying the inputs into a renewable energy and clean and sustainable future for the world. I mean, if you just look at Tesla's stated target of producing 20 million electric vehicles in 2030, that alone will require 3 times the total present global supply of lithium. And that's before you look at what VW's planning and Ford's planning and GM's planning and grid, on-grid and off-grid battery storage requirements to facilitate the next phase of solar and wind. It's monumental, and the answers are very multifaceted, very challenging, and us as an industry, and obviously TechMed, our company as part of the industry, needs to rise to the challenge beyond anything that we've seen, in natural resources in the last 200 years, since the effect of the Industrial Revolution on demand for coal and iron ore.
Absolutely. And Fiona, I want to come to you because I think that, from the mining perspective, it's going to be critical here. If you could unmute yourself. I did the same thing while I ask you this, but so as we have to challenge ourselves and face this sort of, audacious challenges ahead of us, what role does mining have in that? What does that mean for a company like BHP? How is the industry, how is your company going to meet this challenge? Where do you start?
Yeah, it's a great question, Maggie, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. I guess I would reinforce what Brian and Anna have said. At BHP, we've been looking at the impacts of climate change and responses to it for many years using scenario analysis. And this really helps us to think through how the world responds to climate change and what it might mean for the demand for the commodities that we produce, like copper, like nickel. And what we find is that the greater the global efforts to decarbonize, the stronger the impact on demand for copper and nickel, as well as the increasing need for more steel, to build more wind farms, pumped hydro and other decarbonization enabling infrastructure. So in a 1.5 degree scenario, as Anna mentioned, the world's expected to need almost twice as much steel in 30 years as it did in the last 30. And so the world will really rely on iron ore and metallurgical coal that companies like BHP produce. And when we look at things like keeping pace with the development of renewable technologies like electric vehicles and solar energy, then you need copper production to double over the next 30 years. And then also nickel production, as Brian mentioned, it has to increase nearly 4-fold to be able to power the next generation of battery technology. So our industry has to grow if the world is to decarbonize, but it has to grow the right way. So that means having lower operational emissions and also, really importantly, more collaboration to drive down emissions in our value chains. So the way that we think about that at BHP is to not only set emissions targets for our operations, but also to think about how we can collaborate with others. So we've been setting and delivering emissions reduction targets for many years, since the 1990s. We now have a short-term target to keep our operational emissions at 2017 levels in 2022. We also have a medium-term target to reduce our emissions by 30% by 2030, if you like, an equivalent of an NDC for BHP. And we also have an operational emissions target of net zero by 2050. But we've also had to go a step further and set goals to work with our customers to enable them to reduce their emissions downstream of our operations. So it's a real end-to-end process for us.
Yeah, and I think Fiona brings up something interesting here, because this conversation is more nuanced, isn't it? I mean, when we hear about these shortages, she just mentioned some metals that are maybe not on people's list. We go right to lithium. What is the role of mining as we try to address this shortfall? How is the administration approaching it?
I mean, there's a recognition that it plays an important role for all the reasons that we mentioned, including the fact that when we have 7,500 gigawatts of installed power capacity today, it's going to probably double in 2 decades easily. And almost already most of our capacity additions are the renewables that we're talking about, and the EV vehicles that require all of these minerals and metals that are very much dependent on mining. So there's that recognition that a 100-day review process is very much embedded in that and recognizing that. There's also recognition, though, that this is a challenge that requires coordination, to steal Fiona's word, collaboration at a global level, which is why the US with Australia, Botswana, and Canada and Peru launched an Energy Resource Governance Initiative, or ERGI as we call it, because it's important to promote sound mining sector governance and resilient supply chains so that you can actually incentivize more investment in mines abroad and deal with the diversity issue. And under ERGI, there's been a free and public online toolkit that's available. We share best practices from sustainable mining, from discovery of a mineral resource to the closure, reclamation of mines. There's technical assistance that's provided to countries directly, and it's really focusing on the regulatory conditions to incentivize this clean energy investment, to minimize environmental impact, and to also make sure that there's a benefit to local populations. So the administration is looking at very much as mining is important. Mining needs to increase. It needs to increase in a number of different areas that are not prepared for it and have not had it in the past. And so we want to engage, and we want to have the platform to make sure that it's done the right way. For anyone that was sifting through the summit announcements, they might have noticed that we also are essentially joining the Intergovernmental Government Forum on Mining, which allows us to leverage each other's platform for sustainable mining multilaterally. And so we're very excited about that, since IGF has more than 75 nations that committed to this. So we see it as very much, when we step back and take that look, and we need to collaborate, we need to share lessons and bring in as many countries into this discussion as possible.
Absolutely. Brian, I'd like to ask you, we have a question coming in, and that is, how are companies thinking about the volume of critical minerals and metals that are needed to ramp up renewables? This obviously, in this discussion, because of the nature of it, we talk a lot about the industries you're all in, the role of government. What is the private sector in terms of individual companies? You mentioned Tesla's forecast. What is happening with that? And is there cooperation, partnership needed, incentives that are available that can help?
Maggie, just before I comment on that, if I could just follow on from what Fiona and Anna have been talking about, there's a commonly held misperception of the mining and metals industry that it is fundamentally negative from an environmental and social impact point of view. And that doesn't need to be the case. Mining and metal processing can be developed in a manner that's very constructive and responsible environmentally and socially, and low carbon footprint. And that's a crucial element of how we as TechMet are trying to build projects, and how the industry as a whole needs to transform itself in parallel with massively greater volumes of production to meet this exponential growth and demand to create a sustainable, clean world. And that follows on to, Maggie, your question that you've posed as to how the users of these metals, who are busy scaling the electric vehicle fleets and rollout that they're committed to, or renewable energy systems, see the supply chain of critical metals, what we call technology metals. The VWs and Teslas of this world obviously recognize to an extent their sustainable competitiveness is dependent on preferential access to the ingredients going into their batteries and electric motors. And they obviously have the data and analysis and know that these metals are in structural short supply, that their scalability of supply is not efficient and not quick, and that the supply pipeline is dominated, if not controlled, by China, who is essentially a competitor from a corporate point of view and from a national sovereign point of view. What I think they haven't come to the realization of, and I think they will, is that they're going to have to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, if you like, because the problem is how to supply this rollout and the scaling of production. And the solution is not just the industry. The solution is not just government resourcing the industry and supporting the industry in terms of efficient regulation and funding means to support or underwrite funding. The solution has to come from the end user as well. So the VWs, Teslas, BMWs, GMs of this world are going to have to engage in production and processing and take financial risk in order to help to encourage the growth of production and in order to have preferential access to products and inputs. And if they don't do that, they will fall behind competitively relative to their peers in the United States, in Japan and elsewhere, and relative to China Inc., who are 20 years ahead. They've won a war that nobody knew they were fighting till we've lost it. And they now have a supply chain for their battery factories that is, 15 years ahead of anybody else in the world in terms of resilience and degree of control and influence over both primary resource and processing capacity and intermediate products. And that's an enormously pressing and immediate challenge in parallel with volumes, good ESG governance, low carbon footprints, which, the Teslas and VWs of this world will also be judged on increasingly. So they have to participate in resourcing it and making it happen, because the carbon footprint and governance of their chain of supply, increasingly needs to be auditable, transparent, and correct if they're going to protect the integrity of their brands and their products.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's probably an inherent tension that we're all going to have to get over, because I remember a very long time ago, a very wise person, global money manager said to me, no one plays the long game like China. And we are in an environment where companies the investment community is very driven by short-term results, quarter-to-quarter results. Fiona, I want to give you a chance to respond. I know you have strong feelings about the misconceptions, misperceptions perhaps of the mining company. I will put it much more bluntly, a dirty part of what we're trying to get for a green solution. That is sometimes the brush used or the view used on mining. Talk to me a little bit about the problem with that and the sort of hurdles that creates. And then also, when we're talking about investing in these partnerships, what about the investment community? Brian just addressed the companies. There's a lot of capital. These are long-term projects. What role should and does the investment community need to play? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would certainly reinforce the view that Brian's put forward. There is a lack of recognition, I think, on the role of mining and metals to support the low carbon transition. There's no doubt about that. But as I mentioned earlier on, you don't see rapid electrification without copper. You don't see a build out of decarbonisation infrastructure without steel, which takes iron ore and metallurgical coal. And you don't see a scale up of electric vehicle batteries without nickel. One of the things I think people are maybe not so familiar with is the average electric car battery contains 9 kilos of cobalt, 11 kilos of lithium, and 40 kilos of nickel. So these resources are absolutely fundamental to a low carbon transition. And at BHP, we're one of the world's leading nickel suppliers for the battery market. We produce enough nickel powder each year to make 2.5 million electric vehicle batteries. So we really need to make sure that the role of metals and mining in driving that low carbon transition is recognized by stakeholders, and also that companies commit and deliver these commodities with the lowest emissions footprint that they can. Obviously the US is in a really great position with an abundance of resources that can support decarbonisation, and it is really important that these are tapped into in a very sustainable and equitable way. And so it's important for stakeholders to hold companies to account and understand where they stand on these issues, what their commitments are, and importantly, to track their progress. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a very strong commitment to reducing our operational emissions at BHP. And when we think about doing that, we have to focus on things like, where do we source our electricity from? 40% of our emissions come from electricity consumption, 40% from the use of diesel, and the rest of it from a range of things like fugitive emissions and natural gas. So we have to think about how we can get to net zero, switching to renewables, removing diesel from material movement, and also addressing those hard to abate emissions like fugitives. So I think it is really important for stakeholders to hold companies to account, but also to recognize that critical role that these metals can play. And you mentioned about investors. I think there is a growing recognition of the role that these metals can play in decarbonisation, but sometimes that end-to-end consideration isn't necessarily very clear. I've spoken to a number of investors around how we define what green capital looks like or what green revenue looks like. And investors might say to me, well, we see those making wind turbines as providing green revenue or green capital into the market. We support those companies that are producing wind turbines. But we don't necessarily see that translating in supporting the companies that are providing the steel that goes into those wind turbines, or the companies that are delivering those raw materials, the iron ore, for example, that actually delivers that steel supply. So I think we need to think about this in terms of what are the products that we need to deliver, and what are those commodities that give rise to those products, and ensure that the conditions are right to bring all of those to market.
Yeah, excellent point, Fiona. And I think this is why the conversation throughout this entire 2-day summit of the issue of standards of globally consistent measurements has come up again and again. I know it's something you've worked on. Anna, I want to ask you, there will be enormous pressure to meet this demand quickly. You can see that building already. And there's a lot of concern about, how we do that, achieve that, and also alleviate risk to habitat loss or the broader environmental damage. We have a question from George. How can the US incentivize development in mining and supply chain capabilities domestically and in allied countries in a sustainable manner? And interestingly, he says sustainable both in not just the sense of environmental, but not relying on continued government support. How can we scale up quickly, but not have it be at a cost?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't know if we could not have it be at a cost, because I think externalities have value, and that value needs to be priced. And so the reality is that the companies that are doing the right thing, that are looking at their scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions right now, they are the ones that are going to help with our ultimate goal. And there might be a premium. What we want is for that premium to over time become a norm. We essentially are stressing regulations, and we're stressing ESG criteria everywhere, to the point where this is something that is embedded. As the companies are looking beyond their own operations, they too value that. What the administration is also doing is they're putting a lot of R&D money into technology. So if we look at batteries went down in cost by about 80% in the last decade, and the administration has committed to R&D to half those costs. Hopefully that will help offset some increases that might happen on the other side, because compliance does have an extra cost to it, but it's an important cost. It doesn't mean that innovation can't overall drive that down, though.
Brian, to follow on that, okay, it is fantastic that we recognize there will be a cost. There is concern that cost is going to be on the shoulders of developing countries. We have a question: how will this huge increase in demand for these critical metals impact the relationship with the African continent?
I think in the case of Africa, as is the case with other areas of the world where these metals occur and that are therefore important in the outlook of accelerating production, it's a net positive. I mean, there's an enormous amount of reason to invest in the development of these assets. There's an enormous amount of reason to develop and invest in them in a responsible manner from an ESG and carbon footprint point of view. There's a lot of competition, and that competition will grow enormously as to who finances, who controls the flow of product, and therefore who engages politically and economically with these countries in order to, develop what needs to be developed for the sake of renewable energy and electric vehicle revolution. So there are many more positives than negatives. The negatives are obviously the impact on developing markets of being caught in effectively a new Cold War, maybe very different to the old Cold War, but nonetheless one that can result in exacerbating inequalities and political tensions and instabilities in the downside scenario. Hopefully, we'll see much less of that than we will see constructive engagement that balances China, coexists, and achieves what we have to achieve for the world, which is much more production, much more capital being put to work, and for it to be done in a responsible and sustainable way.
Fiona, I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond as well. This issue of meeting the demand and balancing environmental concerns, sustainability, equity is going to be so important. BHP's position and what are some of the innovations you might be looking to? Just unmute before you answer. Your mic is muted again. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So in terms of innovations, I guess I've mentioned about our approach to addressing operational emissions, which is often where many companies start in terms of understanding where their emissions footprint comes from, setting targets to reduce that emissions footprint. One of the things which many companies now are starting to think through is how do we not only think about our own operational footprint, but how do we think about the emissions associated with our full value chain and what opportunities might there be there to work with our customers to enable them to utilize these products that we make in a more sustainable way. So addressing what we call scope 3 emissions. This is often very challenging for mining companies. So unlike many companies where their scope 3 emissions or value chain emissions may be upstream of their operations, in other words, from their suppliers, most of the emissions footprints, the scope 3 emissions footprint for a company like BHP actually occur downstream. So 95% of our value chain emissions happen once our products leave our operations and are sent to our customers. So it's a very, very different dynamic. It's not about being able to procure different goods and services and set standards for our suppliers. It's not about setting targets for our operations alone, but it's about how do we ensure that we can provide our goods and services to our customers in the right way and enable them to use them in a way that reduces their emissions. And that's a really challenging thing for companies to do. So when we've thought about that, we've thought about, well, how do we focus on the value chain emissions, which are the most material to us? And how do we focus on the areas where we have the most influence? And for us, it's really about steel making and also the maritime sector. So we, the majority of our emissions in our value chain come from the steel making sector. So that's where we focus our efforts. Plus, as the world's largest charter of ships, we have an opportunity to influence the maritime sector. But maybe I'll just focus on steel making and particularly bring in this link around technology. So we made a commitment last year that we would work with our steelmaking customers to enable them to achieve their targets as a sector to improve emissions intensity by 30% by 2030. And we said that our role there would be to develop partnerships with steelmakers to catalyze achievement of those targets that they've set. So we've already established 3 partnerships this year with very large steelmakers in China and Japan in particular, focusing on the technologies that can enable them to produce steel in a way that reduces emissions. So things like looking at the role of carbon capture, optimizing the quality of raw materials that we can provide to their blast furnaces, and also modifying the blast furnace itself using oxygen and hydrogen injection. More broadly than working directly with our steelmaking customers, we also have a new ventures arm, which is really looking at the role of these new technologies and how they can decarbonize these sectors of which we're a part. So for example, we've invested $6 million in carbon engineering, which is looking at the development of direct air capture, which is a really groundbreaking technology to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and currently developing what will be the largest direct air capture facility in the world once it's completed in the Permian Basin region of the US. And earlier this year, we backed a $50 million fundraising round for Boston Metal, which is looking to accelerate its molten oxide electrolysis technology to support carbon-free steel making. And that's a really important technology that could really start to decarbonize the steel sector. And, you know, underpinning all of this is this desire to provide these critical commodities, these critical materials that are needed for decarbonization, but to do it in a way that can reduce emissions, the producer and the supplier.
Yeah, and it's so important to look across the entire scope of your supply chain and also the process. I want to take a step back, though, and Anna, you know, every time I think about this and hear Fiona and Brian talk about the time needed and you know, all of the capital investment that's going to be needed, you know, I come back to this idea that everyone acknowledges this technology is needed, these metals are critical, but nobody wants it in their backyard. And we're seeing that play out right now in the US, in Nevada. You know, there's an instance where there's a mine and they're already round the clock protests. And they may be small now, but it seems to me that this is going to be a problem as we look to develop supplies in the US, you know, and across the rest of the world, excluding China, that this may come up again and again. Everyone wants it, but not where it impacts them locally. How do we get past that?
Well, a part of that is a messaging issue. It's there needs to be a realization. I think it's happening that a lot of the traditional sectors that were considered dirty are working. They're responding to consumer and communities' demands. And they're doing a lot of things that Fiona mentioned, that Brian mentioned, in regards to really trying to support the overall goal and to work with communities. I think, of course, in situations where we've seen where it feels like regulations and permitting, things are getting expedited, makes communities nervous, and so a lot of that will require significantly more engagement with communities. It will also require messaging on what the economic opportunity is, what jobs look like, what does mining mean specifically for in the US. I think it's very important, and there's the environmental management portion, the economic opportunity component, but then also when you take it abroad, there's another component, and that is concerns over human rights violations and corrupt practices. And so it will be important to really bring communities in, to really educate them, and to support this move and this understanding that mining has a different makeup, and it's trying and it's working, and to continue to pressure companies to do the right thing and to look at all of their emissions, to look at human rights, to look at jobs and economic opportunity in a way that really incorporates everyone. I think it will require a lot of engagement, a significantly more engagement than we've seen in the past, because we will need to ramp up activity. Though the one thing I do want to comment on is we often talk about, naturally, obviously, the buildup that needs to occur, but one piece of reducing environmental stress is doing less where one can do less. And so energy efficiency, reuse, recycling, trying to keep recycling facilities near intake facilities, making sure it's done in a way that's sustainable, not itself more carbon intensive, and that there isn't transport that has a counteractive effect. And so there are all these other pieces that we need to consider, because when we think about scale and the scale that's going to be needed to meet our goals, we need to also try and step back and think about, well, what can we do less when we can?
Absolutely. And Brian, I just want to let you have the last word here, because we're almost running out of time, but it is so true. That is an important element. And we're actually getting a lot of questions. I wish we had time for all of them from the audience about, can the mining industry, using its expertise, be part of the circular economy? People asking about the seabed mining, and it really, the focus is going to be on innovations, on new technologies, on lessons learned from the past, if we are going to be able to achieve these goals. Talk to me a little bit about what you're going to be thinking about on that front moving forward.
No, thanks, Maggie, and thanks to Anna for raising the issue of recycling, because it is a very important element of this equation, and particularly topical for us as TechMet, where we've supported and financed a lithium-ion battery recycling company called Li-Cycle over the last 2 years. That's now in the process of listing on the New York Stock Exchange. And recycling of lithium-ion batteries, which is an industry in its infancy, but will be a very, very big and important industry in the next 5, 10, and 20 years, can, in our view, by 2030, provide up to 25% of these battery metals for the ongoing growth in production, nickel, cobalt, lithium. And that can make a massively important contribution to localizing and circular supply chains, and to displacing some of the reliance on Chinese control of the supply pipeline, and obviously a massive environmental contribution, given the fact that these lithium-ion batteries are an environmental problem. Our recycling process, and I know others are working on it, and we have plants in Canada and the US now, is very low impact from an environmental point of view, very low carbon footprint, and therefore, this element of the equation will become increasingly relevant, increasingly important, and an increasingly big and valuable industry. And it is another area where government regulatory support, media support is crucial in order to bring more and more lithium-ion batteries, not only large format batteries from electric vehicles, but small format batteries into the recycling pipeline, for it to play the very important role that it can play. I think just one further quick point as to what we need as an industry in order to transform, to play our role in this global revolution, the new industrial and technological paradigm that we all need to succeed. We need price. Prices of these metals has to go up, and they will go up. And that will incentivize more investment into production and allow us to produce in a more sustainable and low carbon footprint manner. But we also need cheap financing. And that's where I think, it's a big conversation, but Anna, from a government perspective, we need a lot of imagination with respect to how the US and the US's allies can underwrite financing in order to facilitate the tens and tens of billions of dollars that the industry needs to spend in order to do what we need to do for the sake of this clean, sustainable future that we want to build. And the Chinese have done that for Chinese interests, and non-Chinese players in this space globally need to now do it in order to balance that supply chain globally. And that's really a call to arms that we all need to work on because it's immediate and urgent.
Yeah, and Brian, we will leave it at that excellent point. We really have just begun to scratch the surface on this very important discussion. Anna, we look forward to the results of the government review, and then we'll absolutely have you back to discuss that. Brian, Anna, Fiona, thank you so much for participating in this discussion today. And thank you for all your work you're doing on this issue.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to pass the stage back to someone you heard from earlier today, Rina Ninan. Rina will be leading a conversation between local leaders from around the world who have all made commitments to address climate in their cities. Rina?
Hi, Maggie. Great to see you, and a great conversation there. As you know, climate change, for it to happen, it's got to have a lot of local action. So I'm thrilled to be able to have this conversation with the mayors of 3 different cities around the globe who are really at the forefront of trying to implement change in their own towns. We've got today the mayor of Bogota, the mayor of Buenos Aires, and the mayor of Milan. All 3 of them will be having a conversation about what they're doing in their cities to make a difference towards climate change. And as you know, mayors have incredibly busy schedules. And unfortunately, the mayor of Buenos Aires was unable to attend live. So instead sent us a special video message. So I'd love to key that up and play that for you right now.
Hola, soy Horacio Rodríguez Larreta, jefe de gobierno de la ciudad de Buenos Aires. Muchas gracias, Foreign Policy, por haberme invitado a compartir este espacio con mis colegas Claudia López de Bogotá y Giuseppe Sala de Milán, para que hablemos sobre un tema tan urgente e importante como es el cambio climático y el desarrollo sostenible. Hace algunos días, el presidente Joe Biden convocó a la cumbre del Día de la Tierra, dando un paso más en el regreso de los Estados Unidos al Acuerdo de París. Iniciativa que celebramos mucho porque la acción climática necesita del esfuerzo coordinado de todos los países y ciudades del mundo. Sin duda, las ciudades tenemos una gran responsabilidad en este problema global. Por eso tenemos que generar soluciones innovadoras y participativas para hacerle frente. Con la alcaldesa de Bogotá, en nuestro rol de vicepresidentes regionales de la red C40, estamos trabajando activamente para sumar cada vez más ciudades de América Latina a la acción climática. Y a nivel local, junto a otros 14 líderes de ciudades de toda la Argentina, lanzamos una alianza para promover la cooperación urbana y diseñar una agenda compartida a nivel federal contra el cambio climático. Hoy ya no hay duda que necesitamos construir ciudades más sostenibles y resilientes para asegurar nuestra calidad de vida y la de las próximas generaciones. Por eso, en Buenos Aires nos proponemos reducir nuestras emisiones a la mitad para 2030 y alcanzar la neutralidad de carbono para 2050. Y además, con nuestro nuevo plan de acción climática, apuntamos a seguir construyendo una ciudad de escala humana, priorizando el espacio público, profundizando la separación de residuos y el reciclado, y trabajando y promoviendo la educación ambiental y el desarrollo sostenible. Las ciudades hemos hecho grandes progresos para cumplir con los objetivos climáticos, pero todavía nos queda mucho por hacer. Las transformaciones que logremos hoy tienen el potencial de generar cambios todavía más significativos a nivel global de cara al futuro. Sigamos por este camino. Muchas gracias.
All right, I want to thank you so much. That was, in fact, the mayor of Buenos Aires, Horacio Rodríguez Larreta, joining us there by video. And I want to bring in for this live conversation, we've got two other mayors joining us, Claudia Lopez Hernandez, the mayor of Bogota, as well as Giuseppe Sala, the mayor of Milan. Welcome to both of you. Mayor Claudia, I'd love to start with you. You know, you're part of, you and Milan as well are part of what's known as a C40 network. These are mega cities that are working together in collaboration, trying to be innovative and partner together to create climate change solutions. What do you believe is really working in your city?
Well, thank you so much to Forest in Policy and all people who has organized this forum. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with you, with my dear friend Giuseppe, and also with Horacio. As you mentioned, we came together to see 40 different cities around the world to collaborate both in climate change, in taking specific actions and plan for reducing pollution in our cities and also green gases. And also we're working together to confront this pandemic, which has been causing so much trouble to us during this year. I think in the case of Bogota, the most important thing is to have reliable data and scientific base to make appropriate decisions. We just measure exactly what's causing climate change in our city, and almost half of the problem comes from fuel fossils, you know, for the type of energy that we're using for transportation. Of that half, almost half come from fridge and half for public massive transportation. So in Colombia and in Bogota, the evolution we're trying to make is for fridge to use at least gas. They're coming from, you know, Euro 0 type of gas. I mean, nothing. It's just the worst type of oil. The fridge is using the worst type of oil. So we're trying to make them to move towards technologies using at least gas. And in the case of public massive transportation, we're trying to move the public mass transportation system of Bogota to electric use, to use of electricity. First of all, building our metro network, which should be not only urban, but regional. We are a metropolitan region of 10 million people. So it's not only moving better and cleaner within the city, but also regionally. Second of all, we are very proud to be the world capital of the bike. We already have 555 kilometers of bike networks in our city. 1 million people daily travel by bike to go to work or to go to study in Bogota. And we're gonna increase that network, that bike network, up to more than 800 kilometers in Bogota in these 3 years. We hope to double the number of travels. And for you to have an idea, bike daily travels in Bogota are already 10% of the daily travels per day in Bogota. For you to have an idea, the first metro line is gonna move half of that, 5% of the daily travels. So it's quite important. The third thing is pedestrians. You know, we all are humans, we are all pedestrians, but at least in Bogota, it's really shameful, the quality and the quantity of pedestrian infrastructure. And they account for 24% of daily travels. So our third goal is to improve public space, to make it greener, safer, more appropriate, to increase or make better the daily travels done by pedestrians. So if you keep accounting 24% of pedestrians and 10% of biking travels, that accounts for 1 out of the 3, you know, daily travels in our city. The fourth thing, so that's take for transportation, which is you know, half of the problem is in transportation. So that's why we're focusing our efforts there. In the investment that we plan for our 4-year term of government, during this 4-year term, we're going to reduce almost by 10% emissions during our own period. By 2030, we're going to reduce half of the emissions. And by 2050, we're going to be carbon free. That's our goal. That's set in our climate change plan, which is a city and nationwide plan. Now, the other half of the problem is related to 3 things, to 3 issues. The first issue is the way we produce waste. and waste management. We are not taking advantage of, green economy in that part of the of waste management. So we're trying to, promote not only a culture of recycling and reuse, but to change the national law. Unfortunately, at the national level in Colombia, garbage collection has no incentives whatsoever for people to separate, waste at home, or for them to have less charges in the utility bill if they recycle than if they don't. So that's, I think, the most important national change law that we're doing. At the local level, we're providing incentives for recycling, reuse, and citizen culture. And the third and last issue that we're tackling is construction, is the way our city is organized. We have a 2-hour day city, it takes 2 hours for our citizens to go and to travel from home to work or from home to study. So we're taking advantage that we are doing our master development urban plan this year, which will last 15 years. And at the same time, we're doing the long-term transportation plan so that we can enforce rules of eco-construction, of constructions and buildings that are, better built with, greener norms. That's one thing. And
Mayor,
the other is waste management.
Mayor, it's incredible, Mayor Hernandez, about how you not only focused on public transportation, but also in things of daily life, such as recycling. I want to turn to Milan, to Mayor Sala as well. Mayor Sala, part of this, of being part of C40, and you have an incredible role in this organization as well, part of it is getting international buy-in, finding those international partners. What do you believe is working in Milan, and who are you partnering with that you believe has helped you in combating climate change?
Yes, thank you, Rina, for the opportunity. Thank you all, and have a good day or afternoon. In Milan, we are 6 p.m. And let me tell ciao to Claudia. At the end of the day, all the cities, all the main cities of the world are working on the same direction. We are completing the 5th metro lines. We are working to increase the percentage of separated waste. We are around 60% now. We have a plan to plant 3 million new trees from now to 2030, and we are working on the bike lanes and so on, so on. So more or less, we are in the same direction. Now, for me, it is fundamental to be part of C40 for some reason. First of all, because I learn, and you can imagine it is easier for me. It is more important for me to learn from other cities in the world instead of Italian cities sometimes, because Milan is, let me say, it's the most international city, and that is fundamental. And I become stronger with my citizens when I tell them I am moving in that direction. For instance, I am creating a low emission zone because London, Paris, Los Angeles are going in the same direction. So you can imagine, because the people having, my fellow citizens having an international attitude, they accept sometimes even some sacrifice, because they see that the most important cities in the world are going in that direction. And let me tell a last thing. I believe the cities have an enormous potential, but we cannot do alone. So we can be the real point to have a confrontation between, the political ideas and the political options, and private sector, civil society, youth, union, and so on, because we have this closeness with the cities. And that is the real point. And the last point that is very, let me say, it is true in Italy, it's very typical in Italy. I am mayor of Milan since 2016, and I'm running again now, hoping to be reconfirmed for a new 5 years. So when you are mayor of a city like Milan, you have 5 years or 10 years. In a country like Italy, where starting from the end of the Second World War, we had 70 governments in 75 years. So you can imagine how many things you can do in a city. So that is the really reason for which I believe it is my duty now to give the right example.
Maricela, I want to thank you for that. And what I'm hearing from you is that camaraderie really has helped in such a big way in bonding with these other mayors and exchanging those ideas. Mayor Hernandez, it's so hard to ignore. Another issue that the mayors have all bonded over, tragically, is COVID-19. How has this pandemic shaped the way you've had to look at climate change?
Well, it actually, many people says that unfortunately, I'm the first woman ever elected to the mayor's office of Bogota. So this was our first opportunity. And we have to confront the worst crisis ever in 100 years for humanity. So it has been so challenging, but I have to say that rather than to change my vision and priorities, I came in 2019, in October, I won the election. And what I proposed to my city was a new social and environmental contract for the 21st century. That was my proposal in October 2019. So actually the pandemic, rather than to change my priorities, actually made evident that it's even more urgent, to have a new social contract and to have a new environmental and green pact for our population, in particular for women and youth. So I think that the challenge real, the pandemic, rather than changing priorities, is making it urgent to find new sources of funding and financing this, making sure, for example, that attending the health priority and the health care that we need to provide to our population today is not going to take away resources for the clean transportation that I was mentioning before. Is that we're not going to renounce to build the metro or the cycleways or the recycling facilities or planting, the more than 1 million trees that we want to plant in the next 10 years, or the gardens or the home grounds that we want to make in our city to make it greener. Rather than displacing these priorities, we need to combine the social, the health, and the environmental priorities that we have. But undoubtedly, we need help from the international system. For example, we cannot be threatened, either the national government or the local governments, by the ratings of financial institutions, that if we don't, make cuts in our budgets, they will downgrade our economies, because that will be threatening. I mean, we need to understand that we're living through, unthinkable times, that orthodox and financial orthodox is not gonna be the way we're gonna move out of this, but being fiscally responsible, but at the same time, being creative, and to some extent heterodox in the way we can move away. To some extent, cities and the world need a Marshall Plan, for this century. And the Marshall Plan for this century is not only, gray infrastructure of the 20th century, it's the green infrastructure of the 21st century.
That's really interesting, Mayor Hernandez, to hear you say a Marshall Plan for climate change for all these different cities. Maricela, I want to ask you, I know you have committed to very bold action on the Paris Agreement. What do you believe is scalable for local governments? What would your advice be as people might look to Milan for what you have implemented? What do you think actually other cities could take part in and join your efforts?
Now in Europe, we have a peculiar situation because you know that through the Next Generation EU, we have a large amount of new funds to be invested for the environment and not only. So in Milan, we are giving, let me say, we are giving the example because the European system is giving to our country 220 billion euros but they are asking to invest those amount from now to 2026, 2027. So it is fundamental to have good projects ready to be implemented. And from that point of view, it is fundamental for us, for a city like Milan, to give a solid demonstration that we can do that. So in our city, normally the social revolution starts from my city, and that is the reason for which we want to. My message to my fellow citizens is: we cannot only suffer the pandemic. And let me remind you that in a city which is not a big city, because we have 1.4 million inhabitants, we had 6,000 deaths for COVID. But we cannot only suffer, we have to get this opportunity like a turning point to accelerate. So we are not inventing a new story, but we can accelerate. And that is the fundamental word, acceleration. So we can do that.
Mm. Yeah, Mayor Sala, it's unavoidable and painful, the cost that COVID has taken on Italy and other countries as well. Mayor Hernandez, I want to let you have the last word from Bogota today. When you talk about governments doing something on climate change, you've also got to have buy-in from businesses. How have you been able to get businesses on board, and how do you incentivize businesses to work with governments?
Well, I think, when I mentioned our climate change plan, this is not a government plan. This is a city-wide plan, with specific goals and tasks, both for society, communities, families, enterprises, and the public sector. I mean, government plans are useless. These are just 4 years short-term political plans. City-wide plans is what we need. And that's what we have done. For example, we have the compromise here of technological transformation of local industries in Bogota. And that's part of our climate action plan. We have the national government compromise to change the waste management policy and tariffs that they have set at the national level, so that they can include specific incentives, in the price of utilities at the local level, so that we can provide every single home, and every single community with economic incentives, not only pedagogic incentives, to do recycling. We have within our climate change plan and a specific compromise of the private sector in transportation to do technological innovation, to move from diesel, very, very, very dirty diesel, at least towards gas, and the public transportation, public and private system, to move from diesel to electric buses or metro, right? So it is a combination of all these things. And as a last word, let me say what I mean by a green 21st century Marshall Plan. That has to take into account our three at least in the developing world, in the case of my city in Bogota, challenges. The first is to link investment in reducing poverty and inequality, right? Connected to promote not only traditional employment opportunities, but green and technological opportunities for women and youth in our cities. And third, the specific goals of our climate action plan. Yeah. What I mean by a Marshall Plan is a plan that connects these three challenges with specific goals and move them ahead in the next 10, 20, and 30 years.
The thought that all of you have put in from your different cities to make sure that this is implemented and takes hold is incredible. I want to thank you, Claudia Lopez Hernandez, the mayor of Bogota, and Giuseppe Sala, the mayor of Milan. Thank you for your ideas and your energy and enthusiasm. It was a great conversation.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you so much.
You bet. And next, I want to turn it over to Foreign Policy Editor-in-Chief, Ravi Agarwal, who is going to join us with a conversation with the Prime Minister of Iceland. Ravi, hello.
Hey, Rina, what a fascinating discussion. Thank you for moderating that. I learned a lot. Buenos Aires, Bogota, and Milan are three cities I love dearly. And it's great to see the mayors of those cities taking the lead on climate initiatives. Rina, thanks a lot.
You bet.
Okay, well, we're almost done here at the FP Climate Summit, but we won't let you go before bringing you one more world leader with a very important message. Iceland for many years now has been grappling with the prospect of a future with no ice. Its glaciers are melting. Where other countries face rising seas, Iceland is confronting a rise in land. Well, how is the country tackling climate change? Iceland is one of the few countries in the world to have elected an environmentalist as its prime minister. Katrin Jakobsdottir was elected PM in 2017 on a platform of fighting climate change. She has budgeted more than $55 million for reforestation and carbon-free transport projects in the next 4 years. I had a chance to speak with her on Monday. Take a listen to our conversation. Prime Minister, the last interview I saw you in, I think it was with the Washington Post, you experienced a live earthquake around you. I'm hoping this one will be a little bit less eventful.
Yes, well, yes. Now the earthquakes have stopped because we've had a volcanic eruption here in the vicinity of Reykjavik. So now we have fewer earthquakes, but we have a new, really, volcano, coming into existence. It's very interesting. It's become the most popular destination in Iceland right now.
Excellent. Well, I hope you and yours are keeping safe, and hopefully we'll still make some news. So let's start with the just concluded White House summit on climate change. The United States promised to cut its greenhouse gases by more than 50% below 2005 levels by the end of the decade. Japan, Canada, Britain, and the EU also committed to steeper cuts. But on the other hand, China, India, and Russia made no new promises. What was your takeaway watching this from Europe? How did you think the summit went?
Well, I think it's very encouraging to see those new announcements on more ambitious emission targets. And obviously, it's really important that the United States is really re-entering the Paris Agreement. It matters greatly for the rest of the world and really underlines the urgency of environmental action and the climate crisis. And I think also it's important to see that the US have linked the climate crisis to national security. So maybe this is the biggest issue, security issue that we are actually experiencing right now in the world. It's the climate crisis. So I think it's encouraging to see the policy changes that are being made. We are seeing climate change returning to the front and center of the US government. And you could also see that other governments were making more ambitious announcements. And that's very encouraging.
That's good to know. You know, Prime Minister, when I speak to leaders from other countries, sometimes they express fears that, you know, in the last 4 years, the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement. It sort of reneged on so many of its commitments. And now, of course, under a new administration, it is trying to take a leadership role on, climate emissions around the world, trying to make sure that countries stick to their commitments or advance those commitments. But do you buy into the worries that this is just a new administration, but in 3 or 4 years, things could change or there could be a return of Trumpism? How do you think, again, sitting where you are in Iceland, how do you think that changes things?
Well, I think what was important about the White House Climate Summit is really that it was not just about the US ambitions, but also about what the rest of the world is going to do. And I think that's really encouraging because if we are going to tackle the climate crisis, it really calls for an international cooperation. And obviously, it was, it mattered greatly that the US was not part of the Paris Agreement for the last 4 years. But the battle, against climate change didn't stop in that time. we saw a lot of encouraging initiatives coming from countries around the world, but also from individual states. So I think looking at it holistically, we are moving forward, but this was a big step now. So I think that, it really encourages you to be optimistic, but obviously we're always seeing backlashes on that road.
Prime Minister, European countries agreed last week to cut greenhouse emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. But there's been criticism in Europe about this. EU parliamentarian Michael Blas was quoted in the media saying that the EU has rushed through a weak climate law for the sake of a photo op with President Joe Biden. What do you make of that comment?
Well, I think we're always really having that debate whether whether our goals should be more ambitious, and then we find us in a debate: how are we going to reach those goals? And Iceland has put forward a goal that we are going to follow Europe in of cutting our emissions up on 55%, and some would say that is a weak goal, but the important thing is, are we going to reach that goal? Our action plan here in Iceland tells me that we can do that. And we're actually seeing cuts in our emissions now between 2018 to 2019, which is encouraging. But I think realistic goals matter very much. But obviously we're going to have that discussion. Is it enough? Can we move faster? And I understand that very well because, I started my career in politics coming from the environmental movement, really, and things have been going way too slowly. So I can very well understand this discussion, but I think what matters most is to achieve some results, to have goals that we actually can achieve, not just nice words on a paper and then nothing happens.
Let's spend another beat on your history and your background coming from the climate movement. And then entering power. In most countries around the world, environmentalists are in the opposition. They usually don't get to wield power. What has that change been like for you? And do you think that you've been able to advance the goals that you had in mind when, from before you were Prime Minister?
Well, absolutely, because I think when I look at the last... if I look at the time that has passed since Iceland actually was part of the Paris Agreement, as you know, but at that time, nobody was, for example, talking about carbon neutrality in Iceland. That was something that just my party talked about, and everybody thought that was a very far-fetched goal. Now, carbon neutrality is not only a goal of the Icelandic government, but we're also seeing the businesses of Iceland participating, saying we want to become carbon neutral at this point, and at this point we're going to do this. So I think actually what has happened, and that is why it's important that we have different political parties in power, is that the climate issue has become really mainstream in Iceland in a very short time. So everybody wants to do their bit in climate, and instead of a discussion, about whether it's important or not, we're talking about, is 55% enough? Should we go further? How can we actually have more motivation to do this faster and speed up things? So I think, yes, it has become, in a relatively short time, very mainstream, and I hope that I have, done my bit in doing that.
Prime Minister, your country's on track to become carbon neutral before most big countries. What can the world learn from Iceland? I mean, so many of the things you've already been talking about how the climate discussion has been mainstreamed. That is not the case for many other parts of the world. How do you do that? And the reason why I ask for lessons is obviously there are hypothetical lessons, practical lessons, but also, your country is well off. And for countries in the developing world, in some senses, it's tougher to have those discussions. So what would your advice be?
Well, it's always difficult to give advice when you're just trying to handle things yourself, if you know what I mean. And we have obviously an unusual profile when it comes to emissions, because we have nearly all heating and electricity generation provided by renewables. And we have the resources to do that, having geothermal energy and also hydro power here in Iceland. So I think in many ways, our position is enviable. We have been focusing on energy shift in our transport system, and we have been moving on quite well in that. So we are maybe faced with a little bit different challenges. Obviously, the richer countries of the world have a great responsibility also towards the poorer countries in really supporting them to achieve their goals. And one of our main focuses is to increase the climate focus in our development cooperation, because it is a very different, at the same time, there is a great inequality in the world, which also is reflected in the climate question. And that's why we need to think about climate justice when we're talking about action against climate change.
What are your fears and worries about the road ahead to Glasgow? I mean, which of the goals you're hearing about do you think are achievable, and what are the parts of countries' agendas that you think are pie in the sky at this point?
Well, as I said, I think the White House summit, it encourages you, and I hope to see announcements of ambitious national targets and followed by real commitments to implement the necessary change that has to happen. Obviously, one is worried because due to COVID-19, we haven't really had the same preparation as for a normal meeting. So it's been quite different. So I think for successful continuation of those talks, I do hope that the meeting in Glasgow will be real life, so that we can actually meet up, because you miss a lot doing everything via internet. But I think when we're talking about this, it's very important to think about, how are we financing our climate action? Where are we putting the money? We need to be very, very clear about that it's important that we are focusing our money to go to renewables and not non-renewables, that we are focusing on new technologies to reduce emissions, but also to increase carbon binding. And I think we have a lot of opportunities there. So I think we need to talk about this in the interaction of world finance. How are we using the world finance to implement change? How are we using new technologies and innovation? And how are we changing the way we live? So it's a very complicated interaction. But I think actually we have a lot of opportunities. So I will stay optimistic.
That's not a bad thing to be. What lessons from the pandemic experience do you think translate to lessons to combat climate change?
Well, the importance of international cooperation, the importance of that, actually the pandemic has showed us how fast we can actually work and how fast we can react. So I think, at least for Iceland, we can draw a lot of lessons from how we have dealt with the pandemic, having this close cooperation with scientists and professionals in really choosing the best ways to deal with the pandemic. I think we can actually do a lot more in that when it comes to climate, in these cooperations with scientists and professionals. We have a special climate committee, which is advisory for the government. But I think we can also open that up, because one of the lessons that we have learned is having that open debate throughout the pandemic, very transparent debate, has actually increased the public information. So I think the Icelandic public knows everything there is to know about the pandemic. And I think we should deal with the climate crisis in the same way, because people usually make very sensible decisions when they have all the information.
Truer words were never spoken. Prime Minister Katrín Jakobsdóttir, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. Iceland's Prime Minister there, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, pointing out how people, when they have all the information that they need, are more likely to act in the best interests of themselves, but also their countries. And we wish Iceland all the best as it races towards its climate goals. But of course, we don't just need individual countries meeting their goals, we need the world to meet its goals. And as we've seen from the last 2 days, it's an immense challenge, the greatest humanity has ever faced, really. I don't know about you, but it's easy to approach the issue of climate change with a sense of doom or a sense of resignation. And that's understandable, but I leave these discussions of the last 2 days with some hope. I found hope because John Kerry explained how climate change as an issue is now above politics, even in a polarized United States. I found hope listening to leaders from Iceland, as we just heard, but also from Japan, Colombia, and Bangladesh, explain how they plan to meet ambitious emissions targets this year. And I found hope in seeing how the private sector can join hands with civil society in creating the right incentives for everyone to push in the same direction. Well, on that hopeful note, all good things have to come to an end, and so it's my turn to say goodbye now, and I'd like to invite on the stage my colleague Susan Sadigova. She's going to wrap things up. Susan is the Vice President of Strategic Development at Foreign Policy. Susan, over to you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Ravi. I mean, what a great note to finish the summit on. And of course, we're very grateful to Prime Minister for sharing her perspective with us. Well, as you said, this brings us to the end of today's programming, and this has really been an exciting and thought-provoking couple of days. We're so excited that we were able to convene such a prolific gathering of top leaders and government and industry and civil society. As our discussions have spotlighted over the past couple of days, it takes cross-cutting resources, commitments, and actions to make the tangible and urgent progress we need on reducing greenhouse gases and on making our economies and industries more sustainable. And we at Foreign Policy do hope that would spark momentum for better and hopefully for more effective collaboration. Thank you again very much to our distinguished speakers who joined us yesterday and today. Thank you to our great partners for supporting this important program: Government of Japan, European Union, Nuclear Energy Institute, Chevron, RBC Capital Markets, TechMed, and BHP. Thank you for your support. And thank you to our audience. We had many thousands have tuned in over the past couple of days. We hope you learned something, and I encourage you to keep the conversation going on social media using the hashtag FB Climate Summit. If you missed any part of yesterday's program, it's already available on our website, and today's program will also be available on our website shortly. And lastly, please stay tuned for more events for Foreign Policy. We have 2 events coming up next week. You can check them out and register at foreignpolicy.com/events. And with that, thank you again and see you soon.